Imagine a land where freedom and danger walked hand in hand beneath vast skies, where golden sunlight spilled across endless prairies and painted desert canyons in fire. Before the railroad stitched the continent together, before telephone wires hummed with distant voices, the American West was a place of whispered legends and hard-won truths. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we'll journey across this untamed frontier, from the ancient peoples who first called these lands home to the last dusty cattle drives of the closing frontier. We'll wander through bustling boom towns and across silent mountain passes, where ordinary people carved extraordinary lives from a landscape as beautiful as it was unforgiving. What unfolded across the American West was nothing less than the meeting of worlds, each with everything to lose and everything to gain. For the native peoples who had lived in harmony with these lands for countless generations, the very fabric of existence hung in the balance. Ancient ways of life, spiritual connections to sacred places, and the freedom to follow traditional paths all faced an advancing tide of change that could not be turned back. For those who journeyed westward, whether in covered wagons creaking across mountain passes, on horseback with little more than hope and determination, or later in crowded immigrant ships and rattling trains, the West represented a final chance. Some fled poverty, persecution, or the shadows of their past. Others chased golden dreams of wealth from the earth's bounty, or simply longed for enough good land to feed a family. Many sought something more elusive, a fresh beginning in a place where a person might define themselves beyond the rigid boundaries of the world they left behind. Between these colliding hopes moved the forces of nature itself, devastating droughts, brutal winters, and vast distances that swallowed the unprepared. Here too were the forces of progress and power, railroad barons and cattle kings, government agents and army commanders, all with their own visions for this contested land. The story of the Wild West isn't just about who would control the territory on a map. It's about whose dreams would shape America itself. The answers forged in this magnificent landscape, through blood and courage, cooperation and conflict, echo through our world to this very day. Tonight, as you close your eyes, let's travel back to witness how these vast horizons changed everyone who ventured beneath them. Long before the first European boot pressed into the soil of the American West, these lands cradled ancient civilizations within their embrace. Before cattle drives and gold rushes, before wagon trains and railroad tracks, the vast territories stretching from the Mississippi to the Pacific belonged to the land itself and to the peoples who had called it home for countless generations. To understand the story of the Wild West, we must first understand the stage upon which this drama unfolded, a land of startling beauty and breathtaking diversity. Imagine yourself standing on the eastern edge of the Great Plains, where the tall-grass prairie begins its westward sweep. The wind moves through the grasses like invisible fingers combing through hair, creating rippling waves that stretch to the horizon. These grasslands, some of the richest soil on Earth, once covered nearly 1 million square miles of the continent's interior, a sea of grass so vast that early travellers compared crossing it to an ocean voyage. In spring, wildflowers painted the landscape in splashes of purple, yellow and red. In summer, the grasses grew tall enough to brush a rider's stirrups. In autumn, they turned golden and rust-coloured before winter winds bent them low. As you journey westward, the tall grass gradually gives way to short-grass prairie where the rainfall grows scarcer. The land begins to rise almost imperceptibly at first, climbing toward the great backbone of the continent. On the horizon, the first glimpse of the Rocky Mountains appears, a jagged line of snow-capped peaks cutting a sharp boundary against the blue sky. These mountains form a continental divide, sending rainfall and snowmelt either eastward toward the Atlantic or westward toward the Pacific. Their rugged slopes hold treasures that would later drive much of the Western story. Veins of gold, silver, and copper hidden beneath ancient rock. Mountain passes became crucial gateways, determining where travellers could cross this massive barrier, channeling movement like the narrow part of an hourglass. Beyond the Rockies lies a land of basins and ranges, valleys nestled between mountain chains, many so dry they qualify as true desert. The Great Basin stretches across Nevada and parts of surrounding states, a vast inland sea during ancient times, now reduced to scattered salt lakes. Here, sagebrush and greasewood replace grass, and travellers might walk days between reliable water sources. Further south, the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts bloom with strange and beautiful adaptations. Saguaro cactus standing like silent sentinels, their arms raised to the sky. Reaching the far western edge brings us to yet another world, the forests and mountains of the Pacific coast. In the northwest, massive trees create cathedral-like groves where little sunlight reaches the forest floor. Rainfall measured in feet rather than inches nourishes these giants. Rivers teem with salmon so abundant that early accounts describe being able to walk across streams on their backs during spawning season. Through this stunning landscape flows a network of rivers, the lifeblood of the land. The mighty Mississippi forms the eastern boundary, while its powerful tributary, the Missouri, reaches deep into the northern plains. The Colorado carves the Grand Canyon on its journey through the southwest. The Columbia gathers waters from the northwest before breaking through coastal mountains to reach the Pacific. These waterways served as highways long before roads existed, determining where people settled and how they travelled. The climate across this vast region varies dramatically, from the humid east to the arid interior to the temperate coast. Weather could be harsh and unpredictable. Blizzards sweeping across the plains with temperatures dropping 50 degrees in hours, summer thunderstorms building massive clouds before unleashing violent hail, drought years when even hardy native grasses withered and died. Within this environment lived the first inhabitants of the West, diverse indigenous peoples whose civilizations had developed over thousands of years in harmony with these varied landscapes. Though often portrayed as a single group in simplified stories, Native Americans comprised hundreds of distinct nations with unique languages, customs, spiritual beliefs, and ways of life. On the Great Plains lived nations whose lives intertwined with the American bison. Massive creatures that once roamed in herds so vast they could take days to pass a single point. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Blackfeet, Crow, and many others developed cultures centered around these animals. Contrary to popular belief, many of these nations practiced agriculture before horses arrived, growing corn, beans, and squash along river valleys, venturing onto the open plains for seasonal hunts using sophisticated driving techniques. The arrival of horses, which had spread northward after being introduced by Spanish colonizers, transformed plains cultures. Nations like the Comanche became masters of horsemanship, developing riding skills that astonished European observers. Mounted hunters could harvest bison with new efficiency, while greater mobility allowed for expanded trade networks and military capabilities. In the southwest, peoples like the Navajo, Apache, and Pueblo nations adapted to desert environments through sophisticated knowledge of local plants, animals, and water sources. The Pueblo peoples built remarkable multi-story dwellings from stone and adobe that still stand today, some continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years. They developed irrigation systems to nurture corn, beans, and cotton in an arid landscape where each drop of water was precious. Along the Pacific coast, nations like the Chinook, Salish, and Tlingit developed cultures of remarkable abundance based on the ocean's bounty. Their carved cedar canoes navigated coastal waters with remarkable skill. Complex social systems managed the harvest and distribution of salmon, while elaborate potlatch ceremonies redistributed wealth through gift-giving. In the mountain valleys of the Rockies, nations like the Shoshone and Ute developed intimate knowledge of high-altitude environments, moving seasonally to follow game and harvest plants. Their understanding of mountain passes would later prove invaluable to early European explorers who relied on indigenous guides. These diverse peoples were not isolated from one another. Extensive trade networks connected distant regions long before European arrival. Shells from the Pacific coast have been found deep in the continental interior. Turquoise from the southwest adorned items in the Great Lakes region. Obsidian tools were traded hundreds of miles from their volcanic sources. These exchanges moved not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and beliefs across the continent. Governance among indigenous nations varied widely, from the Democratic Confederacy of the Iroquois that influenced American constitutional thinking, to hereditary chiefdoms, to fluid leadership structures based on specific skills needed for different situations. What these systems shared was sophisticated approaches to managing resources and resolving conflicts that had evolved over centuries of experience with their homelands. At the heart of most indigenous worldviews lay a fundamentally different understanding of humans' relationship with the land than the one Europeans would bring west. Rather than seeing land as property to be owned and exploited, most indigenous cultures viewed themselves as belonging to the land, as relatives and caretakers of a living system that sustained them. This did not mean they left the environment untouched. They actively managed forests through controlled burning, cultivated wild plant foods to increase yields, and altered landscapes to enhance hunting opportunities. But these practices worked within natural systems rather than attempting to conquer them. This philosophy extended to their understanding of time and history. Many indigenous oral traditions speak of their people's origins in these landscapes since time immemorial. a connection so ancient it transcends historical reckoning. Creation stories often describe the formation of sacred landmarks that anchored their spiritual understanding of place. Mountains, rivers, unusual rock formations, and other natural features were not merely scenery, but living presences with their own stories and significance. Seasonal cycles guided indigenous life throughout the West. Spring might bring ceremonial dances timed to the emergence of particular plants. Summer could see gathering expeditions to harvest berries, roots, or medicines. Fall often centered around communal hunts or harvests to prepare winter stores. Winter brought a time for storytelling, when wisdom passed between generations around hearthfires while snow gathered outside. This deep knowledge of place, accumulated through thousands of years of careful observation and passed down through generations, allowed indigenous peoples to thrive in environments Europeans initially found harsh and unforgiving. They understood which plants could heal illness, which provided food, and which offered materials for tools, baskets, and clothing. They read subtle signs in animal behavior, cloud patterns, and plant growth that foretold weather changes or seasonal transitions. When Europeans first encountered these sophisticated civilizations, they often failed to recognize what they were seeing. Looking through the lens of their own cultural expectations, they sometimes mistook careful land management for wilderness, diplomatic protocols for primitive rituals, and complex governance for simple tribal organization. This fundamental misunderstanding would become the tragic foundation for much of what followed as two profoundly different worldviews collided across the Western landscape. As we continue our journey through the history of the Wild West, we must remember that every mountain, river, and plain we encounter was already named, known, and held in the living memory of peoples who had called these places home for countless generations. Their story does not begin with European arrival. It extends back through millennia of civilization intimately connected to the land. The chapter of Western expansion that would follow represents not the beginning of history in these regions, but a dramatic turning point in a much longer human story. The ancient peoples of the West had lived for countless generations beneath those endless skies, adapting to the rhythms of mountains, deserts, and plains, when the first strangers arrived from across a vast ocean they had never imagined. These newcomers came seeking gold, glory, and souls to save, bringing with them horses, iron, and diseases that would forever transform the Western landscape. The first Europeans to venture into what would become the American West were the Spanish. In 1536, a small band of ragged, half-starved men emerged from the wilderness onto the northern frontier of Mexico. Their leader, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, had survived 8 extraordinary years of wandering, shipwreck, enslavement, and eventually reverence as a healer among various indigenous peoples. His tale of adventure and rumors of 7 golden cities somewhere in the northern desert ignited the Spanish imagination. The Viceroy of Mexico soon dispatched a Franciscan friar named Marcos de Niza to investigate these golden cities, supposedly built by an ancient civilization. Guided by one of Cabeza de Vaca's companions, a North African enslaved man known as Estebanico, Fray Marcos journeyed northward into present-day Arizona. When Estebanico was killed advancing ahead of the main party, Fray Marcos claimed to have glimpsed from afar a magnificent city gleaming like gold in the desert sun. He never reached it, returning instead with tantalizing reports of this place called Cibola. His descriptions were enough to launch the first major European expedition into the American Southwest. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led some 300 Spanish soldiers, accompanied by over 1,000 indigenous Mexican allies, hundreds of horses and herds of livestock northward in search of the 7 cities of Cibola. What they found instead of gold-paved streets were the multi-story adobe pueblos of the Zuni people. Impressive certainly, but not the treasure houses Spanish dreams had conjured. Despite this disappointment, Coronado pressed on, sending smaller parties to explore in all directions. His men became the first Europeans to view the staggering depths of the Grand Canyon, the first to see the massive buffalo herds of the Great Plains, the first to encounter the semi-nomadic Apache and Comanche. For 2 years they wandered, pushing as far north as present-day Kansas before finally admitting defeat and returning to Mexico. We reached Cibola, one expedition member wrote, and found a little village, with houses of stone and mud, crumbling and ill-built. In the whole village there was not a thing made of gold or silver. The cities of gold had been a mirage, but the Spanish had acquired something perhaps more valuable: knowledge of the vast territories that lay beyond Mexico's northern frontier. 50 years later, in 1598, Juan de Oñate led a colonizing expedition up the Rio Grande Valley. Unlike Coronado's military foray, Oñate brought settlers, establishing the first European colony in the southwest near present-day Santa Fe, New Mexico. The Spanish system of colonization centered around three key institutions: the mission, the presidio, fort, and the civil settlement. Franciscan friars built missions to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, while presidios housed soldiers to protect Spanish interests and enforce compliance. For the Pueblo peoples who had lived along the Rio Grande for centuries, Spanish arrival meant dramatic change. The newcomers demanded tribute in food and labor, while missionaries waged a relentless campaign against traditional spiritual practices. The Spanish gathered all our sacred objects, a Pueblo account recalled, our prayer sticks and masks and ceremonial items, and burned them before our eyes, telling us our ways were of the devil. Tensions built slowly over decades, finally erupting in 1680 when a religious leader named Pepe organized a coordinated uprising across dozens of pueblos. The Pueblo revolt successfully drove the Spanish entirely from New Mexico for 12 years, the most complete reversal of European colonization in North American history. When the Spanish returned in 1692, they adopted more conciliatory policies, allowing greater religious tolerance while maintaining political control. The Spanish entrada left permanent marks on the southwest landscape: herds of sheep transforming indigenous economies, mission churches rising from adobe soil, new crops like wheat and fruit trees taking root in irrigated valleys. Spanish words seeped into indigenous languages, while indigenous knowledge of plants, water sources, and survival techniques proved essential to Spanish adaptation. Place names still echo this first European presence: Santa Fe, San Antonio, Los Angeles, even as the region's cultures blended into something neither fully European nor fully indigenous. Far to the north, a different pattern of exploration was unfolding. While Spanish came primarily as settlers and missionaries establishing permanent colonies, French voyageurs penetrated the continental interior as traders and trappers, building relationships rather than settlements. Moving by canoe along the vast waterways that connected the Great Lakes to the Mississippi watershed, these French adventurers sought not gold but beaver pelts, the soft gold that fed Europe's insatiable demand for felt hats. The coureurs des bois, runners of the woods, were often young men of humble origin who adopted indigenous ways to survive in the wilderness. They learned to navigate by bark canoe, to make pemmican for winter journeys, to track animals through dense forest, and to communicate in trade languages that mixed French with Algonquian dialects. Many took indigenous wives, creating kinship networks that facilitated trade while establishing new mixed heritage communities throughout the Great Lakes and upper Mississippi regions. Unlike the Spanish emphasis on converting indigenous peoples, French policy centered on building trade alliances. "We come as brothers," was their typical approach, bringing goods you desire in exchange for the rich furs of your hunting grounds. The French colonial presence was light: scattered trading posts rather than farms or ranches, individual traders rather than settler families. This approach allowed French influence to extend far beyond their actual numbers. By the early 1700s, French explorers were pushing ever westward. Pierre Gaultier de Varennes, Sieur de la Vérendrye, and his sons ventured across the northern plains, possibly glimpsing the Rocky Mountains in the distance. In the south, enterprising traders followed the Missouri River deep into the continental interior, establishing relationships with nations like the Pawnee, Omaha, and Mandan. French goods, glass beads, metal tools, woolen blankets, firearms, moved along indigenous trade routes, reaching peoples who had never seen a European face. These exchanges transformed indigenous economies and power structures. Tribes with access to French trade goods, especially weapons, gained advantage over traditional rivals. The Comanche, masterful adopters of horses introduced by the Spanish, combined these new mounts with French firearms to build a powerful empire on the southern plains. The Blackfoot similarly used trade advantages to extend their influence across the northern plains. Every European item incorporated into indigenous life changed some aspect of traditional culture. Metal pots replacing ceramic vessels, glass beads taking the place of porcupine quills in decorative work, guns altering hunting and warfare. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, ended the official French presence in North America in 1763, but French-Canadian voyageurs continued their forest travels under British and later American flags. Their knowledge of waterways, indigenous languages, and survival techniques would prove invaluable to the next wave of exploration. The young United States, having secured its independence from Britain, soon looked westward with intense curiosity about the territories beyond the Mississippi. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson orchestrated the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's size overnight by acquiring from France an immense, largely unmapped territory stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. Jefferson, a man of science and boundless curiosity, immediately planned an expedition to explore this new acquisition. To lead this ambitious journey, Jefferson selected his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, who then recruited a frontier-savvy army officer named William Clark as co-leader. Their corps of discovery would be the first American expedition to cross the continent, though their primary mission was scientific and diplomatic rather than colonial, to study the geography, peoples, plants, and animals of the West while establishing peaceful relations with indigenous nations. Lewis spent months preparing, studying medicine, botany, zoology, and celestial navigation with the leading scientists of Philadelphia. The expedition departed St. Louis in May 1804, poling and pulling their keelboat up the muddy Missouri River. The corps included some 30 permanent members, soldiers, hunters, interpreters, and Clark's enslaved man York, who would be the first black man many Western tribes had ever seen. Their journey unfolded as a series of diplomatic engagements with the powerful nations of the Missouri Valley. The Otoe, Omaha, Yankton Sioux, Teton Sioux, Arikara, and Mandan. Each encounter required careful protocol, ceremonial speeches, gift exchanges, and negotiations for safe passage. At the Mandan villages in present-day North Dakota, the Corps built Fort Mandan to spend the winter, their last contact with the United States for nearly 2 years. Here they met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trader, and his young Shoshone wife Sacagawea, who was carrying her infant son. Recognizing that Sacagawea's language skills and knowledge would prove invaluable when they reached the mountains, Lewis and Clark hired the couple as interpreters. Her presence proved crucial not only for communication, but also as a sign of peaceful intentions. As Clark later noted, "A woman with a party of men is a token of peace." After wintering with the Mandan, the expedition pressed westward into lands no Americans had seen. They navigated the river's treacherous currents, endured vicious mosquitoes, encountered massive grizzly bears, and marveled at vast herds of buffalo and pronghorn antelope. Lewis filled journal pages with detailed descriptions of new species, the pronghorn, bighorn sheep, prairie dog, and many others previously unknown to science. The most challenging segment came when they reached the Rocky Mountains in present-day Montana. Instead of finding the anticipated Northwest Passage, a direct water route across the continent, they faced formidable mountain ranges requiring an arduous overland crossing. Only with the help of the Shoshone, Sacagawea's people, who provided horses and guidance, could the expedition continue westward across the Continental Divide. Descending the western slope via the treacherous rapids of the Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia rivers, they finally reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805. "Ocean in view! Oh, the joy!" Clark wrote in his journal, though the rainy, foggy Pacific Northwest winter that followed was anything but joyous for the Corps, who spent months in damp discomfort waiting for spring to begin their return journey. The expedition arrived back in St. Louis in September 1806, having travelled over 8,000 miles in 28 months. Only one man had been lost, and they returned with precious maps, scientific specimens, and detailed journals describing the people, places, and natural wonders of the West. While public attention focused initially on geographic discoveries, perhaps their most important legacy was the wealth of ethnographic information they gathered about dozens of indigenous nations, their languages, customs, political structures, and territories. Jefferson's hope that the expedition would open pathways for American trade in the West would soon be realized, though not in the ways he had envisioned. Rather than the anticipated water route to the Pacific, Americans would forge overland trails. Rather than the fur trade with China that Jefferson had imagined, a domestic fur industry would emerge as the first significant American presence in the Rocky Mountains. This era of the mountain men began almost immediately after Lewis and Clark's return. In 1807, Manuel Lisa established the first American fur trading post on the upper Missouri, recruiting experienced frontiersmen to venture deeper into the Rockies. One of these men, John Coulter, became the first American to see the geothermal wonders of what would later become Yellowstone National Park, though his descriptions of boiling mud and steaming geysers were dismissed as Coulter's hell, the fabrications of a wilderness-addled mind. Over the next 3 decades, the beaver-rich streams of the Rocky Mountains drew hundreds of hardy trappers, men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, Kit Carson, and Tom Fitzpatrick, whose names would become legendary in Western lore. These mountain men live solitary lives for much of the year, setting their beaver traps along cold mountain streams, always alert for grizzly bears or hostile warriors. A beaver trap weighs about 5 pounds, one account notes, and a typical trapper might carry 8 to 12 of them, along with his rifle, powder, lead, blankets, and minimal provisions. Travelling alone through some of the most rugged terrain on the continent, despite their popular image as loners, the mountain men established a unique community through the annual rendezvous system. Each summer from 1825 to 1840, hundreds of trappers gathered at predetermined locations in mountain valleys like Pierre's Hole or Brown's Hole. Here, supply caravans from St. Louis arrived with trade goods, ammunition, tools, tobacco, and whiskey. For a week or two, the mountains echoed with raucous celebration as the normally solitary trappers enjoyed rare social contact, competitive games, storytelling, and often excessive drinking. The rendezvous became multicultural gatherings where European Americans, French Canadians, Mexican traders, and members of numerous indigenous nations met, traded, formed alliances, and sometimes intermarried. Like the voyageurs before them, many mountain men took indigenous wives, learning their languages and ways while establishing kinship networks that enhanced their safety and success in the wilderness. Their intimate knowledge of Western geography made the mountain men invaluable as guides for later military expeditions and emigrant trains. Jim Bridger could reportedly draw detailed maps in the dirt showing mountain passes and water sources across vast territories. Jedediah Smith completed some of the first traverses of the Southwest deserts and the Sierra Nevada range. Joseph Walker pioneered routes that would later become emigrant trails to California. The beaver trade had profound ecological impacts. By the late 1830s, beaver populations had been decimated across much of the West, altering stream flows, riparian vegetation, and habitat for countless other species. The mountain men themselves recognized the destruction they were causing. "We trapped all the little streams and branches until hardly a beaver was left," reminisced Joe Meek, and the country wasn't the same afterwards. As the beaver trade declined, many mountain men transitioned to new roles, as guides, army scouts, trading post operators, or ranchers. Their knowledge of indigenous languages and customs made them valuable intermediaries during treaty negotiations, though their loyalties were sometimes divided between their indigenous families and advancing American interests. The era of the mountain men was brief, scarcely 3 decades, but it established patterns of movement, cultural exchange, and environmental exploitation that would continue as the American nation pushed relentlessly westward. With each wave of contact and exploration, the indigenous West became increasingly tied to distant markets and imperial designs, its resources mapped for future development, its peoples categorized for future policy decisions. By 1840, as the last rendezvous faded into memory, a new chapter was beginning. Americans were starting to see the West not just as a place to extract resources, but as a place to settle permanently. The first wagon trains were rolling westward on what would become the Oregon Trail, carrying families rather than lone adventurers. The era of exploration was giving way to the era of emigration, bringing changes more profound than anything that had come before. As mountain man Jim Bridger reportedly warned the first settlers he encountered, "They're coming now, but they won't stop coming. There's more of them than you can imagine, and when they're done, nothing will be the same." Jim Bridger's prophetic words echoed across the land as the 1840s dawned. The wilderness pathways, once travelled only by mountain men and native peoples, were about to become highways for thousands of settlers with dreams of new beginnings. The trickle of westward migration that had begun in previous decades was about to transform into a flood that would forever alter the American landscape and the countless peoples who called it home. This dramatic shift in American history emerged from a powerful idea taking hold in the national imagination. A belief that would be given a name in 1845 when newspaper editor John O'Sullivan wrote of America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent. The phrase crystallized a conviction already burning in many American hearts that their young nation was divinely ordained to expand westward, carrying its institutions, values, and people across the entire continent from Atlantic to Pacific. This belief had deep roots in American religious and political thought. Many settlers saw themselves as a new Israel, chosen by God to create a more perfect society in a promised land. Politicians framed westward expansion as the natural fulfillment of the democratic experiment, creating new opportunities for citizens to acquire land and exercise their freedoms. Economic interests saw untapped resources waiting to be developed. The combination of these religious, political, and economic motivations created a powerful current pulling Americans westward. Artists played a crucial role in popularizing this expansionist vision. Painters like Albert Bierstadt and Thomas Moran created massive luminous canvases depicting the Western landscape as an Eden-like paradise bathed in divine light. These paintings, displayed in eastern cities, inspired viewers with visions of majestic mountains, fertile valleys, and endless opportunities waiting in the West. Writers penned accounts of Western adventures, and newspaper editors published glowing reports of fertile soil and temperate climates. For many ordinary Americans facing economic hardship in the aftermath of the Panic of 1837, these romantic visions of the West offered tangible hope. A farmer struggling with exhausted soil and mounting debts in the East could dream of starting fresh on 640 acres of free or inexpensive Western land. A shopkeeper watching his business fail might envision a new start in a booming frontier town. For religious minorities facing persecution, the vast Western spaces promised room to worship as they pleased. Yet this dream of manifest destiny looked very different through indigenous eyes. For native peoples, this westward push represented not divine providence, but a gathering storm that threatened their way of life, their lands, and their very existence. From the Mexican perspective, American expansionism appeared not as progress but as naked aggression from a covetous neighbor. These conflicting visions of a divinely ordained mission versus an unjustified invasion would shape the unfolding drama of Western settlement. The Great Migration began in earnest in the early 1840s with the establishment of what would become known as the Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile route stretching from Independence, Missouri to Oregon's Willamette Valley wasn't a single path but a network of interconnected trails, including branches leading to California and later Utah. What began as a barely marked track used by fur traders and missionaries evolved into a well-worn highway as thousands of emigrants moved westward. The decision to embark on this journey wasn't made lightly. Families sold farms, businesses, and possessions that couldn't be carried. They invested their life savings in wagons, oxen, supplies, and tools needed to establish new homes in distant territories. Most understood they would never see their extended families again. Letters might take months or years to reach loved ones left behind, if they arrived at all. Spring was the time of departure, as wagons gathered at jumping-off points along the Missouri River. Independence, St. Joseph, and Council Bluffs became seasonal boomtowns as emigrants purchased final supplies, organized into companies, and waited for prairie grasses to grow enough to feed their animals on the journey. The atmosphere combined the excitement of a county fair with the solemnity of a church gathering. Merchants hawking wares, children playing among wagon wheels, preachers offering farewell sermons, and family members sharing tearful goodbyes. These wagon trains weren't random collections of vehicles but organized communities with elected leaders, written constitutions, and established rules. Democracy flourished on the trail as ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants found themselves voting on issues from disciplinary measures to travel schedules. Women, though unable to vote in the United States, sometimes participated in these trail decisions. One emigrant noted in his diary, "Our little republic on wheels makes its own laws as we travel." Daily life on the trail fell into a relentless rhythm. Camp stirred before dawn with the call, "Catch up, catch up." Breakfast, usually coffee, bacon, and bread, was prepared and eaten quickly. Oxen were yoked, mules harnessed, wagons loaded, and by sunrise the caravan was moving. The typical day covered 15 to 20 miles at a pace barely faster than a walking human. Contrary to popular imagery, few emigrants rode in their wagons. These vehicles, not the large Conestoga wagons of later movies but smaller prairie schooners with white canvas covers, carried precious supplies and possessions. Walking alongside saved wear on animals and wagons and spared travellers the bone-jarring ride over rough terrain. One emigrant woman wrote home, "I have walked enough to reach Oregon twice over, I am certain." The day's journey ended in late afternoon with the formation of a protective circle of wagons. Animals were unhitched to graze, firewood gathered, meals prepared, repairs made to equipment, and guard duty assigned. After supper, there might be music from a fiddle or harmonica, story sharing around fires, entries written in journals by lantern light, and exhausted sleep under wagon covers or the open sky. Through this landscape of daily challenges moved a remarkable diversity of people. While popular imagery often depicts a homogeneous stream of white Anglo-Saxon pioneers, the reality was more complex. German and Scandinavian immigrants joined the westward migration. Free black families sought opportunity away from the racism of eastern states. Hispanic traders traveled the Santa Fe Trail. Chinese immigrants would later arrive on the Pacific coast and work eastward. This human tapestry, moving across indigenous lands, created cultural exchanges and conflicts that would shape Western communities for generations. The trail itself traversed an ever-changing landscape. The initial journey across the Great Plains confronted travellers with endless horizons of grass and sky that disoriented those accustomed to forests and hills. Many described the sensation as similar to being at sea. One woman wrote, "Nothing breaks the monotony but occasional herds of buffalo so distant they appear as dark specks, or the even more distant line of bluffs that shimmer like islands in the heat." Natural landmarks became important psychological milestones. Chimney Rock rising like a sentinel from the plains, Scott's Bluff's imposing presence, Independence Rock where thousands carved their names as they passed. The most formidable obstacles came with mountain crossings, first the Rockies, later the Sierra Nevada for those bound for California. Wagons were sometimes dismantled and lowered by ropes down steep slopes too treacherous to descend intact. Disease proved a more deadly enemy than the hostile Indians many emigrants feared. Cholera swept through wagon trains with terrifying speed, killing within hours of the first symptoms. Graves lined the trail, sometimes several from a single family. One diarist recorded passing 10 fresh graves in a single day's travel. Accidental gunshots, drownings at river crossings, and injuries from wagon accidents added to the toll. Historians estimate that nearly 1 in 10 who began the journey never completed it. Yet for all its hardships, the Oregon Trail represented hope and determination that defined the American character. Women gave birth in wagon beds, children collected wildflowers during rest stops, young couples fell in love and were married along the way. Simple pleasures, a rare sugar cookie, a bath in a clean stream, an evening of dancing when the day's journey had been good, punctuated the difficult passages. Communities formed and reformed as faster wagons passed slower ones or groups split over disagreements about routes. By the late 1840s, a distinctive branch had formed on the Westward Trail, leading not to Oregon or California, but to the shores of the Great Salt Lake. Here, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly called Mormons, sought to build their own society away from the persecution they had faced in the East. Their migration represented a unique chapter in the Westward movement, combining religious motivation with exceptional organization and communal effort. The Mormon exodus began in February 1846 when the first groups left Nauvoo, Illinois, following years of conflict with their neighbors and the murder of their founder, Joseph Smith, in 1840. Under the leadership of Brigham Young, they established temporary settlements in Iowa and Nebraska territories, including the large winter quarters near present-day Omaha, where they regrouped and planned their journey to a new promised land beyond the Rocky Mountains. The advance company of 148 Mormons, led by Young himself, reached the Salt Lake Valley in July 1847. Standing on a rise overlooking the valley, weak from a recent illness, Young reportedly declared, "This is the right place. Drive on." Unlike other Western migrations motivated primarily by individual opportunity, the Mormon movement represented a community transplantation, with members pooling resources and working together to establish a new society. Their settlement at Salt Lake City demonstrated remarkable planning and irrigation expertise, transforming desert land into productive fields within months. Young designed the city with wide streets in a grid pattern, communal grazing areas, and centrally located civic and religious buildings. As more believers arrived, they established a network of communities throughout what they called Deseret, stretching from present-day Idaho to San Diego. Not all Mormon migrants traveled by wagon. In 1856-1857, nearly 3,000 European converts who couldn't afford wagons and teams made the journey with handcarts. Wooden carts, they pulled themselves across more than 1,000 miles of prairie and mountains. Most completed the journey successfully, but 2 companies started too late in the season and were trapped by early snowstorms in Wyoming. More than 200 died before rescue parties from Salt Lake City reached them. The Mormon community's desire for isolation would be short-lived. In 1848, events far to the southwest dramatically accelerated American migration to the west. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, transferring vast territories to the United States, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This war had begun in 1846 following long simmering tensions over the American annexation of Texas, which had won independence from Mexico in 1836 but remained claimed by the Mexican government. President James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist, had campaigned on acquiring California and settling the Oregon boundary dispute. When Mexico rejected his offer to purchase California and New Mexico, Polk ordered American troops to the disputed zone between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. The resulting skirmish provided the pretext for a declaration of war. American forces under General Zachary Taylor defeated Mexican armies in northern Mexico, while General Winfield Scott led an amphibious landing and subsequent march to capture Mexico City itself. Meanwhile, American settlers in California, supported by explorer John C. Fremont and a small U.S. military force, staged the Bear Flag Revolt and proclaimed California independent. The war deeply divided American society. Supporters viewed it as fulfilling manifest destiny and securing valuable Pacific ports. Critics, including Abraham Lincoln and Henry David Thoreau, condemned it as an immoral land grab from a weaker neighbor. For Mexicans, the conflict represented a traumatic loss of nearly half their national territory. For the approximately 80,000 Mexican citizens living in these transferred lands, the treaty promised American citizenship and protection of their property rights, promises that would be unevenly fulfilled in subsequent decades. Just 9 days before the treaty was signed, on January 24, 1848, an event occurred that would transform American migration to the West more profoundly than any government policy or military campaign. At Sutter's Mill in the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada mountains, James Marshall noticed shining flecks in the mill race, where he was building a sawmill for Swiss entrepreneur John Sutter. His discovery of gold, which Sutter vainly tried to keep secret, would trigger one of history's greatest rushes for sudden wealth. News spread slowly at first, but by mid-1848 San Francisco had emptied as residents flocked to the goldfields. Ships arriving in the harbour were abandoned by crews who deserted to seek their fortunes. When President Polk confirmed the gold discoveries in his December 1848 address to Congress, the trickle of fortune seekers became a flood. Throughout 1849, some 90,000 49ers converged on California, roughly 80,000 Americans and 10,000 from Latin America, Europe, Australia and China. Unlike earlier migrations focused on farming and permanent settlement, many gold seekers intended only a temporary stay to gather wealth before returning home. They travelled by 3 main routes: the lengthy sea voyage around Cape Horn, the shorter but disease-ridden passage across Panama's isthmus, or the overland trails. The human flood transformed California from a sparsely populated territory to a state admitted to the Union in 1850, skipping the usual territorial stage entirely. Mining camps sprang up overnight wherever gold was discovered, creating instant communities with little formal governance. Violence, vigilante justice, exorbitant prices, and dangerous working conditions characterized these settlements. One observer described a typical mining camp as 3 parts saloon and 1 part everything else. Yet amid the chaos, miners developed practical systems for recording claims and resolving disputes that would later influence formal mining law. For most miners, the dream of easy wealth remained elusive. By 1850, easily accessible placer deposits, loose gold in streambeds, were largely exhausted. Mining companies with significant capital replaced individual prospectors, introducing hydraulic mining methods that blasted hillsides with high-pressure water cannons, causing environmental devastation as debris flows choked rivers and destroyed farmland downstream. The pattern established in California would repeat throughout the West. In Colorado's Pikes Peak Rush of 1859, Nevada's Comstock Lode Silver Boom beginning the same year, the Black Hills Gold Rush in Dakota Territory in 1874, and numerous smaller mineral discoveries. Each boom created a sudden population surge, hastily built towns and eventual busts when deposits were depleted or became too expensive to extract. As the 1850s began, the American West had been transformed in ways few could have imagined a decade earlier. Oregon and California had become American territories with rapidly growing populations. Mormon settlements flourished in the Great Basin. Trading posts and military forts established strategic footholds on the plains. The westward movement that had begun as a trickle had become a flood, carrying with it dreams of wealth, religious freedom, and new beginnings. Yet for the indigenous peoples who had inhabited these lands for countless generations, and for the Hispanic communities that had called the Southwest home for centuries, this transformation represented not opportunity, but dispossession and threat. The concepts of land ownership, resource use, and governance brought by American settlers often clashed fundamentally with existing practices. The conflicts that would emerge from these different visions of the West's future would shape the region's development for decades to come. As the nation tore itself apart over the question of slavery, the vast territories west of the Mississippi River stood at a crossroads of their own. The land that had drawn so many dreamers westward during the gold rush now faced new questions of identity and allegiance. While the cannons roared at Gettysburg and Shiloh, the story of the American West continued to unfold under the long shadows cast by the nation's bloodiest conflict. Unlike the eastern states, where battle lines were clearly drawn and armies clashed in devastating encounters, the Civil War in the West played out across sprawling landscapes where distances themselves became formidable enemies. Here, small forces manoeuvred across territories larger than many European countries, fighting not only each other, but also the harsh realities of desert, mountain, and plain. In the Southwest, Confederate ambitions reached far beyond the traditional South. Jefferson Davis and his generals envisioned a confederacy stretching to the Pacific, incorporating the mineral wealth of California and the trading ports of the West Coast. This grand design of the Confederacy called for securing New Mexico territory as a corridor to the Pacific, then using it to expand Confederate influence throughout the Southwest and eventually to California. In early 1862, this vision seemed briefly within reach. Confederate Brigadier General Henry Hopkins Sibley led about 2,500 Texans up the Rio Grande Valley, capturing Albuquerque and Santa Fe. At the Battle of Val Verde in February, Southern forces gained a tactical victory, pushing Union defenders northward. Confederate sympathizers throughout the Southwest began to hope their cause might prevail, but the tide turned dramatically at Glorieta Pass, a narrow canyon in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains southeast of Santa Fe. There, in March 1862, Union forces, including Colorado volunteers who had marched over 400 miles in 13 days, engaged Sibley's Texans in what would later be called the Gettysburg of the West. While the main battle ended inconclusively, a Union flanking force discovered and destroyed the Confederate supply train, effectively ending Southern hopes in the Southwest. "Our future operations depend entirely on our ability to procure supplies," wrote one Confederate officer afterward. "In this barren country, food for man and beast is hard to find." Without provisions in this unforgiving landscape, Sibley had no choice but to retreat to Texas. The Confederacy's western ambitions died in the mountain passes of New Mexico. Further north, the war played out differently. In what would become Colorado, Montana, and Idaho, gold and silver discoveries continued drawing thousands of fortune seekers, even as the nation fractured. These mining communities maintained complex relationships with the conflict. While officially Union-controlled, many included Southern sympathizers alongside Northerners and immigrants, with little stake in the distant war. Financial connections link these remote territories directly to the conflict. California's gold, shipped east by steamer and across Panama, then north to New York, helped finance the Union war effort. By 1863, approximately $173 million in California gold, worth billions in today's currency, had reached Union coffers. This steady flow of precious metal helped maintain the North's credit and currency stability, while the Confederacy struggled with mounting inflation. Along the contested border states and territories, particularly Missouri and Kansas, the war took on a brutal personal character. Guerrilla warfare between pro-Union Jayhawkers and pro-Confederate bushwhackers turned neighbors against each other in cycles of raid and reprisal. William Quantrill's Confederate raiders sacked Lawrence, Kansas in August 1863, killing over 150 civilian men and boys. Union militias responded with their own harsh measures, sometimes forcing civilian relocations to deprive guerrillas of support. This intensely personal conflict left lasting scars across the region. "We lived in fear, not knowing which side might come through next," recalled one Missouri farm woman years later. Both sides took what they wanted and suspected everyone of helping their enemies. As battle raged in the east, a different kind of revolution was transforming the western landscape. A revolution in communication that would permanently bind the nation together, even as war threatened to tear it apart. On October 24, 1861, just months after the first shots at Fort Sumter, the final connection in the transcontinental telegraph line was completed near Salt Lake City, Utah. East instantly connected with West as the first cross-country message flashed between Chief Justice Stephen J. Field in California and President Abraham Lincoln in Washington. "With the completion of this great work," one newspaper declared, "our country becomes emphatically one and indivisible." Messages that once took weeks or months by stagecoach could now reach their destinations in minutes. Market prices, military orders, news of battles, and personal messages traversed the continent at unprecedented speed, collapsing distance in ways previous generations could hardly have imagined. The completion of the telegraph line meant the end of one of the West's most romantic but short-lived enterprises, the Pony Express. For just 18 months, from April 1860 to October 1861, Young riders had carried mail between Missouri and California, galloping relay style along a 600-mile route. These messengers braved harsh weather, treacherous terrain, and occasional hostile encounters to maintain tenuous communication links between East and West. Buffalo Bill Cody, who claimed to have ridden for the Pony Express in his youth, though historians debate this, later romanticized the service in his Wild West shows. The Pony Express was the first fast mail line across the continent. Messages were carried by relays of riders, night and day, through storm and sunshine, over mountains, across rivers. Despite its brief existence, the Pony Express captured the public imagination as a symbol of courage and connection across the vast western spaces. As telegraph wires spread across the West, mail service expanded as well. The Postal Service Act of 1862 standardized operations, while overland stage lines continued delivering heavier packages and passengers. Newspapers flourished in western towns, sometimes appearing even before permanent buildings. These local papers reprinted national news from telegraph dispatches, connecting isolated communities to national conversations about the war and its meaning. Information connected the West to the nation's center, but land itself remained the primary concern for many settlers. Even amid civil conflict, the federal government embarked on one of the most significant land policy shifts in American history. The Homestead Act of 1862. This legislation, long blocked by Southern congressmen who feared it would create new free states, passed easily after secession removed their opposition. The act's premise was revolutionary in its simplicity. 160 acres of public land would be granted to any adult citizen, or intended citizen, who lived on the land for 5 years and improved it. For the price of a small filing fee, about $18, a family could own a farm larger than many European estates. Land for the landless, proclaimed supporters. The legislation seemed to promise Jefferson's vision of America as a nation of independent farmers. In reality, the implementation proved more complex than the ideal. The 160-acre allotment, generous in the well-watered East, often proved insufficient on the arid plains where much more land was needed to support a family. The requirement to build a dwelling and cultivate crops demanded capital beyond many immigrants' means. Success rates varied dramatically by region. In Minnesota and eastern Nebraska, where rainfall was adequate and markets accessible, many homesteaders established viable farms. Further west on the high plains, success rates dropped below 30%. Some struggling settlers sold their claims to neighbors or speculators, contributing to land consolidation despite the law's democratic intentions. Fraud plagued the system from its inception. Dummy entrymen filed claims on behalf of timber companies or cattle operations. Others manipulated the system through false improvement claims or bribes to land office officials. One investigation in Nebraska found land officers who considered it their right to supplement their salaries with fees received for special favors rendered. Despite these flaws, the Homestead Act fundamentally reshaped the West. Between 1862 and 1934, over 1.6 million homestead claims would be processed, transferring 270 million acres, about 10% of all United States land, to private ownership. The legislation created opportunities for some while accelerating dispossession for others, particularly Native Americans whose traditional territories became increasingly fragmented by white settlement. For indigenous peoples of the West, the Civil War years brought devastating changes. With national attention focused on the conflict between North and South, Western tribes found themselves facing reduced federal oversight but increased vulnerability to local militias and settlers. The regular army units that had maintained some semblance of order along frontier boundaries were largely withdrawn for Civil War service, replaced by volunteer regiments with varying levels of discipline and often hostile attitudes toward Native Americans. Far from the famous battlefields of the Civil War, some of the conflict's most tragic episodes unfolded in the West. In Minnesota, the Dakota War of 1862 erupted when promised annuity payments failed to arrive, leaving Dakota Sioux facing starvation while traders refused to extend credit for food. "If they're hungry, let them eat grass," reportedly remarked one trader, a statement that would be remembered bitterly in the violence that followed. After initial Dakota attacks on settlements, panic spread throughout Minnesota. Volunteer militias and federal troops under Colonel Henry Sibley, not to be confused with a Confederate general of the same surname, suppressed the uprising within weeks. What followed was the largest mass execution in American history. After hasty trials conducted in English, a language many defendants didn't understand, 303 Dakota men were sentenced to death. President Lincoln personally reviewed the trial records and commuted most sentences, but on December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously in Mankato, Minnesota. The surviving Dakota, including many who had opposed the conflict or protected white settlers, were expelled from Minnesota. Their reservations were dissolved, their treaties abrogated, and most were sent to barren lands in present-day South Dakota and Nebraska. "The past cannot be recalled," declared Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey. The Indian title to Minnesota has been extinguished. Further west, along the Colorado frontier, tensions between settlers and Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples escalated throughout 1863 and 1864. Various incidents and misunderstandings fueled cycles of revenge, while Territorial Governor John Evans authorized citizens to kill and destroy hostile Indians. Colonel John Chivington, a Methodist minister turned military leader, led a volunteer regiment of 100-day enlistees eager to see action before their terms expired. On November 29, 1864, Chivington's forces attacked a peaceful encampment at Sand Creek, where Chief Black Kettle had been assured of safety. The Southern Cheyenne leader had even raised an American flag above his lodge as a sign of peace. The attack became one of the most notorious massacres in Western history. Approximately 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, most of them women, children, and elderly, were killed and their bodies mutilated. "I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than any I ever saw before," testified one soldier who had refused to participate. "Women cut all to pieces, children 2 or 3 months old." When news of Sand Creek reached Eastern newspapers, public outrage led to congressional investigations. Chivington was denounced but never punished, having already left military service. The massacre ignited years of intensified warfare across the Central Plains, as outraged Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors sought vengeance against white settlements. While the nation fought over whether states could leave the Union, the federal government significantly expanded its authority in the West. In 1862, the same Congress that passed the Homestead Act also approved the Pacific Railway Act, granting massive land subsidies to transcontinental railroad companies. The following year, national banking legislation created a standardized currency system that facilitated Western commerce and investment. The foundations for post-war expansion were being laid even as the Civil War raged. When the conflict ended in 1865, attention would turn westward with renewed intensity. Hundreds of thousands of veterans familiar with travel and skilled with weapons would seek new opportunities in Western territories. Union generals like William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan would bring their strategic thinking and wartime experiences to campaigns against Native Americans. The West that emerged from the Civil War era was increasingly bound to national markets and federal authority. Telegraph lines had collapsed communication distances, new land policies were reshaping settlement patterns, and the transcontinental railroad would soon physically unite the continent. Yet this integration came at devastating cost to indigenous peoples, whose resistance to displacement would shape the next chapter in Western history. As the guns fell silent across the divided nation in 1865, America turned its gaze westward with renewed determination. The dream of binding the continent with iron rails, a vision temporarily sidelined by 4 years of bloody conflict, suddenly resurged with unstoppable momentum. In the halls of Congress and the boardrooms of railroad companies, in frontier towns and immigrant neighborhoods, a single conviction took hold. The time had come to stitch together a nation torn by war through the most ambitious engineering project the world had ever seen. The roots of this grand endeavor stretched back to before the conflict. In 1862, even as the Union Army suffered devastating losses on eastern battlefields, President Lincoln had signed the Pacific Railway Act, authorizing the construction of a railroad connecting the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. The legislation granted generous subsidies, both land and money, to 2 competing companies. The Union Pacific would build westward from Omaha, while the Central Pacific would build eastward from Sacramento. The race to complete the greatest transportation project in American history had begun, though the war years slowed progress to a crawl. With peace came a new sense of urgency. The Union Pacific, directed by Thomas Dock Durant, a man whose ambition was matched only by his talent for financial manipulation, began pushing westward across the Great Plains in 1866. Durant had assembled a workforce of recently discharged Union veterans, Irish immigrants escaping poverty, freed slaves seeking opportunity, and restless men drawn to high wages and adventure. "You could hear a dozen languages in those UP work camps," recalled one Nebraska settler who watched the construction. The air filled with hammering, shouting, and cursing from sunup to sundown, and when night fell, the camps burst into songs and fights and card games. It was like nothing we'd ever seen in these quiet plains. Meanwhile, on the western slope of the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains, the Central Pacific faced challenges of an entirely different magnitude. Led by the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, the company confronted some of the most forbidding terrain on the continent. Sheer granite cliffs, deep ravines, and winter snows that could reach depths of 40 feet stood between their Sacramento starting point and the summit of the mountains. Labor proved an immediate and critical challenge. White workers frequently abandoned railroad work for the gold fields when rumors of new strikes circulated. After initial struggles with workforce stability, Charles Crocker's foreman suggested an experimental solution: hiring Chinese laborers. The first small group of Chinese workers proved so industrious and reliable that Crocker soon arranged for thousands more to be recruited directly from Guangdong province. By 1867, over 12,000 Chinese men, nearly 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce, labored on the railroad's advance through the mountains. These workers, typically standing no more than 5 feet tall and weighing around 120 pounds, accomplished engineering feats that astonished observers. The Chinese workers' contribution cannot be overstated. They blasted 15 tunnels through solid Sierra granite, sometimes progressing only inches per day. They built elaborate wooden trestles across deep canyons. During the terrible winter of 1866 and 67, entire work crews lived in tunnels carved beneath the snow, emerging only to continue their dangerous labor on the mountainside. Hung Hua, a Chinese labor contractor, described the work in a letter home. "The mountains reach the sky, and the snow never melts. We hang from ropes to place the black powder charges. When the explosion comes, many do not return to camp. Their bodies lie beneath the tracks we lay. Each mile crosses 100 graves." Despite their critical contribution, Chinese workers received only 2/3 the wages of white laborers, supplied their own food, and lived in canvas tents while white workers had wooden bunkhouses. When they organized a strike in 1867 to demand equal pay, the company simply cut off their food supply and waited until hunger forced them back to work. On the Union Pacific's end, Irish immigrants formed the backbone of the workforce. Many had fled the devastating potato famine that had ravaged Ireland in the 1840s, only to find themselves facing harsh discrimination in eastern cities. The railroad offered escape and opportunity, hard, dangerous work, but with wages that could support families back home or building new lives in America. Michael Finnegan, who laid track across Nebraska, wrote to his brother in County Cork, "The work breaks a man's back and the sun blisters his neck. But there's $3 a day to be had, and no foreman asking what church you attend before hiring you on. We're building something that will last long after these blisters have healed." The daily progression of the railroad followed a carefully choreographed sequence. Advanced teams of surveyors plotted the route, followed by grading crews who cut through hills and filled valleys to create a level path. Behind them came the track layers, and finally the bolting crews who secured the rails to the ties. A good crew could lay between 1 and 3 miles of track per day on flat terrain. The Union Pacific made rapid progress across the relatively flat plains of Nebraska and Wyoming, sometimes completing 7 miles of track in a single day. By contrast, the Central Pacific's progress through the Sierra Nevada was excruciatingly slow, in some months advancing less than a mile. Beyond the physical challenges of construction lay the equally formidable obstacles of finance, politics, and corruption. The government subsidy of $16,000 per mile of track, and more in mountainous terrain, plus alternating sections of land extending 20 miles on either side of the track, created enormous opportunity for profit and for fraud. Thomas Durant's Credit Mobilier scheme represented perhaps the most notorious example. Durant created a construction company, Credit Mobilier, that he secretly controlled while serving as a UP executive. He then arranged for this company to receive enormously inflated contracts from the railroad, effectively paying himself to build the railroad at taxpayer expense. When congressional investigation threatened, Durant simply distributed shares in the company to key legislators, creating one of America's first major corporate corruption scandals. By 1868, the Central Pacific had finally conquered the Sierras and began making rapid progress across the Nevada desert. The Union Pacific, meanwhile, had crossed Nebraska and Wyoming, with both companies now driving their lines toward Utah. What had begun as a cooperative venture gradually transformed into a fierce competition, with each company seeking to claim as much of the valuable land grants and cash subsidies as possible. As they drew closer, the race intensified. Work crews sometimes laid track around the clock, illuminating their labor with bonfires and oil lamps. Both companies employed armed guards to protect their advance parties, occasionally resulting in tense standoffs where the competing lines surveyed overlapping routes. Finally, in April 1869, Congress intervened to designate Promontory Summit, Utah as the meeting point. On May 10, 1869, the nation witnessed what some called the greatest media event of the 19th century. The joining of the two railroads with the driving of a final golden spike. Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific, and Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific each took ceremonial swings at a golden spike connected to telegraph wires. With each strike, the telegraph clicked out the message to a waiting nation. Done. In that moment, the continent was united as never before. A journey that had once required months of dangerous travel by wagon train or sailing vessel could now be completed in a matter of days. The significance of the transcontinental railroad's completion extended far beyond mere transportation. The nation's perception of time and space underwent a profound transformation. Railroad companies soon divided the country into 4 standardized time zones in 1883, replacing the chaotic patchwork of local times determined by each town's position relative to the sun. A passenger could now set their watch with confidence that it would match the railroad's schedule in the next town. Western communities connected to the transcontinental line experienced explosive growth, while those bypassed often withered. Cities fought ferociously, offering subsidies and land grants to ensure the railroad passed through their territory rather than a rival location. The railroad companies themselves wielded enormous influence, often determining which settlements would thrive and which would disappear. When the surveyors came through, recalled Wyoming settler Thomas Burley, everyone knew our town's fate hung on their decision. Past 2 miles to the north, and we'd be hauling our buildings there within the month. Miss us entirely, and we'd be a ghost town by Christmas. The railroad was life itself out here. The iron rails transformed the economics of Western settlement. Farmers and ranchers gained access to distant markets. Miners could ship ore to processing facilities, and manufactured goods flowed westward. Towns along the route became supply and service centers, their economies growing alongside the increased traffic of goods and people. For Native American nations, the railroad's completion represented a disastrous acceleration of forces already threatening their way of life. The iron road cut through hunting grounds, frightened game with its noise and smoke, and brought an ever-increasing flood of settlers. The great buffalo herds, already diminishing, faced commercial hunters who supplied meat to railroad construction crews and shot the massive animals from train windows for sport. By 1883, the creatures that had once darkened the plains by the millions had been reduced to a few hundred survivors. The railroad stimulated industrial development throughout the West, particularly in mining. Earlier gold and silver rushes had relied on individual prospectors with simple tools, but the railroad era saw the rise of industrial mining operations requiring heavy machinery, chemical processes, and large workforces. Companies could now ship massive equipment to remote locations and transport ore to distant processing facilities. In Nevada's Comstock Lode, miners descended thousands of feet into the earth in search of silver, using square-set timbering techniques to prevent cave-ins in the unstable ground. Steam-powered pumps removed groundwater that would otherwise flood the deep shafts. The mines required millions of board feet of timber, resulting in the deforestation of entire mountain ranges to feed the industry's insatiable appetite for wood. Similarly transformative technologies revolutionized gold mining. Hydraulic mining used high-pressure water cannons to literally wash away hillsides containing gold deposits, while dredgers scooped up river bottoms to process the gravel for precious metals. These methods dramatically increased gold production, while causing environmental devastation on an unprecedented scale. Hillsides collapsed, rivers clogged with debris, and downstream farms found their fields buried under feet of mining waste. The corporation emerged as the dominant organizational form for these industrial ventures. Unlike earlier mining rushes where individual prospectors staked claims, the new operations required capital investment far beyond the means of ordinary individuals. Corporate mining operations brought managerial hierarchies, systematic extraction methods, and absentee ownership to regions previously characterized by independent operators. Company towns arose around many Western mining operations, communities where one corporation owned the housing, stores, and often the local government itself. Workers in these settings found themselves dependent on their employer not just for wages but for nearly every aspect of their lives. The company store extended credit but charged inflated prices, creating cycles of debt that bound workers to their jobs more effectively than any contract. Labour organisations developed in response to these conditions. The Western Federation of Miners, founded in 1893 after bloody strikes in Idaho's Coeur d'Alene mining district, became one of the most militant labor unions in American history. Mining communities from Colorado to Nevada experienced repeated cycles of strikes, lockouts, and sometimes violent confrontations between workers and company-hired security forces. These industrial transformations unfolded with stunning rapidity. Within a single generation, vast portions of the West shifted from territories where indigenous peoples and natural ecosystems had prevailed for millennia to industrialized landscapes of mines, mills, railroads, and cities. Boom and bust cycles became a defining feature of Western economic life, as communities rose with the discovery of valuable resources and often collapsed when those resources were exhausted or market prices fell. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed just 4 years after the Civil War's end, had indeed bound the nation together with bands of iron, but it had also unleashed forces of industrial development, environmental transformation, and social change that would reshape the American West forever. The frontier era wasn't ending. It was transforming into something new, an industrial landscape where steam, steel, and corporate power replaced the covered wagon and the solitary prospector's pan. While railroads and mining operations transformed parts of the West with industrial development, vast territories remained primarily agricultural, domains of cattle, crops, and the people who tended them. Here, a different kind of frontier took shape, one where humans grappled not primarily with each other, but with the land itself, with weather that could swing from drought to deluge, with distances that swallowed unwary travelers, and with natural cycles that could bring fortune or ruin. The story of cattle in the American West began in Spanish colonial territories. Longhorns, descendants of Spanish cattle brought to Mexico centuries earlier, had adapted to the harsh conditions of the borderlands. These rangy, tough animals with horns spanning up to 7 feet tip to tip flourished in the brush country of southern Texas. By the Civil War's end, an estimated 5 million wild longhorns roamed Texas, essentially free for the taking by anyone who could round them up and move them to market. The problem was finding that market. Texas ranchers knew beef commanded high prices in eastern cities, but getting it there required moving live animals across hundreds of miles of often hostile territory. The solution emerged through a remarkable combination of entrepreneurship, hard work, and environmental knowledge, the long cattle drive. In 1866, an ambitious Texas rancher named Charles Goodnight and his partner Oliver Loving blazed what would become known as the Goodnight-Loving Trail, driving their herds from Texas westward to avoid hostile territories, then north to the railheads in Colorado. Other cattle barons like Joseph McCoy envisioned shipping points closer to Texas, convincing the Kansas Pacific Railroad to establish a stockyard at Abilene, Kansas in 1867. This created the destination for what would become the most famous cattle path in American history, the Chisholm Trail. Between 1867 and 1885, more than 5 million cattle would make the journey up the Chisholm Trail from Texas to Kansas. The typical drive involved 2,000 to 3,000 head of cattle, moving at a pace of 10 to 15 miles per day. A trail boss led the operation, with perhaps a dozen cowboys, a wrangler to manage the spare horses, and a cook who maintained the chuck wagon, not just preparing meals but serving as the mobile headquarters of the entire operation. This mobile kitchen, invented by Charles Goodnight himself, consisted of a modified army wagon with compartments for cooking equipment, medical supplies, and trail tools. The cook, often an older cowboy or a man with disabilities that prevented regular riding, ranked second only to the trail boss in authority. Rising before dawn to prepare breakfast and among the last to sleep, the cook provided the stability around which trail life revolved. The cook's word was law, recalled one trail driver. No one would think of contradicting him, least of all the trail boss. His meals might be simple: beef, beans, biscuits, and strong coffee, but heaven help the drover who complained. One cook I knew made a man eat every bit of a biscuit the fellow had called heavy enough to kill a man, standing over him with a loaded revolver until the last crumb was gone. The journey north typically took 2 to 3 months, filled with natural hazards. River crossings posed particular danger. Swift currents could easily sweep away cattle and cowboys alike. Stampedes presented another constant threat. Thousands of half-wild longhorns could be set running by something as simple as a lightning flash, a snapping twig, or a cowboy lighting a match in the dark. Once in motion, a stampede was nearly impossible to stop, only to gradually turn into a circular pattern until the cattle exhausted themselves. Texas cowboy E.C. Abbott described the terror. When a herd stampedes at night, it sounds like 1,000 thunderstorms. The ground trembles under your feet. The only thing to do is ride with them and try to reach the leaders and turn them. I've seen stampedes where the cattle ran 15 miles before stopping. At the trail's end waited the cattle towns: Abilene, Ellsworth, Newton, Wichita, Dodge City, and others. These communities transformed from sleepy agricultural settlements into raucous commercial centers each summer when the Texas herds arrived. Hotel rooms filled, saloons stayed open around the clock, and merchants of all types competed for the cowboys' hard-earned wages. Cattle towns balanced precariously between orderly commerce and frontier chaos. The earliest ones lacked effective governance, but quickly developed specialized law enforcement. Town marshals like Wild Bill, Hickok in Abilene, and Wyatt Earp in Wichita enforced local ordinances prohibiting firearms within city limits and kept the peace between cowboys, farmers, gamblers, and townspeople. Despite their later mythologizing in Western fiction, these peace officers primarily maintained order through reputation and the selective application of force rather than through gunfights. The economic impact of the cattle trade was substantial. At its peak, a single season could see hundreds of thousands of longhorns arrive at shipping points. Joseph McCoy's operation in Abilene shipped 35,000 cattle its first year and over 600,000 during the boom years. Each animal worth perhaps $4 in Texas might bring $40 at the railhead. By 1871, when the Kansas Pacific Railroad reached as far west as Ellsworth, cattle worth over $2 million annually moved through that single shipping point. This prosperity attracted outside investment. British and Scottish capital flowed into Western cattle operations, creating immense ranches controlled by foreign corporations. The Prairie Cattle Company, financed by Edinburgh investors, amassed holdings of over 100,000 cattle and 1 million acres across Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. The Exit Ranch in the Texas Panhandle, created when the state exchanged 3 million acres for construction of its Capitol building, became the largest fenced ranch in the world. As trail driving declined with the expansion of railroads, the cattle industry evolved toward more permanent ranching operations. The open range system that dominated the 1870s allowed cattle to graze freely across vast unfenced territories. Ranchers claimed ownership not of land but of the animals themselves, identified through distinctive brands burned into the cattle's hides. Spring and fall roundups brought ranchers together to sort their intermingled herds, brand new calves, and select animals for market. This system rested on an understanding that western grasses constituted a common resource. "We never thought of owning the land," recalled Wyoming cattleman John Clay. "What we wanted was the grass and water. Land was merely something to hold them." Such open-range operations required minimal investment beyond the livestock themselves. Cattle essentially raised themselves, grazing on public domain lands that cost the rancher nothing. Labor needs were seasonal rather than year-round, with perhaps one cowboy required for every 300 to 500 head of cattle. The cowboys who worked these herds represented a far more diverse group than later mythology would suggest. Perhaps a quarter were black men, many formerly enslaved who had acquired cattle skills in the South. Mexican vaqueros, whose riding and roping techniques predated Anglo-American ranching by centuries, made up another significant portion. Native Americans, immigrants from various European countries, and Civil War veterans from both armies rounded out the workforce. Their daily life during the ranching season combined isolation, danger, and stunning natural beauty. Working from before dawn until after dusk, cowboys spent most of their time in the saddle. One recalled, "When I went to bed, I could still feel the movement of the horse under me, still hear the sound of the hooves, still see the cattle strung out ahead." They located scattered herds, moved cattle to fresh grazing areas, doctored sick animals, rescued those trapped in bogs or ravines, and protected the herd from predators and rustlers. The equipment and techniques of this occupation came largely from Mexican vaquero traditions. The western saddle with its prominent horn, designed for securing a rope when working cattle, the lariat, from Spanish lariata, the bandana used to filter dust, chaparreras or chaps to protect legs from brush and thorns, and even the term buckaroo itself from vaquero all reflected Mexican influence. Skills like cutting individual animals from the herd and roping required years to master. The life blended freedom with hardship. Pay typically range from $25 to $40 per month plus board. Decent wages compared to Eastern factory work, but coming with constant danger, exposure to weather extremes, and seasonal unemployment. While popular imagery associates cowboys with gunfights and violence, their weapons were carried primarily for protection from wildlife and hostile tribes, not for settling personal disputes. As more settlers moved west, another agricultural frontier developed alongside ranching, the farming frontier. The promise of free or inexpensive land drew thousands of homesteaders to the Great Plains, where they faced environmental challenges unlike anything in their previous experience. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres to any adult citizen, or intended citizen, who lived on the land for 5 years and improved it. This democratization of land ownership represented a dramatic shift from European systems where land remained concentrated in the hands of aristocrats and landlords. Subsequent legislation like the Timber Culture Act 1873 and Desert Land Act 1877 offered additional acreage to those willing to plant trees or irrigate arid lands. Settlement patterns reflected transportation access, with the earliest homesteaders claiming lands near rivers or railroads. Development typically began with a dugout or a sod house, pragmatic shelters built from available materials in a largely treeless environment. These soddies used blocks of prairie turf stacked like bricks to form walls, with a roof of poles covered by more sod. Thick walls provided excellent insulation, but these dwellings also harboured insects, leaked during heavy rains, and required constant maintenance. Life on homesteads demanded unrelenting labour from every family member. Breaking the thick prairie sod required specialised equipment, either a breaking plough pulled by multiple teams of oxen or horses, or the new steel ploughs developed by manufacturers like John Deere specifically for prairie conditions. After ploughing came planting, cultivating and harvesting, all done initially with hand tools or horse-drawn implements. For most homesteaders, the first years brought more hardship than prosperity. Without established farms nearby, they had to travel long distances for supplies. Medical care might be days away. Churches and schools were established only after communities reached sufficient population density. Isolation and loneliness affected many settlers, particularly women who often had limited social contact beyond their immediate families. Environmental challenges tested even the most determined homesteaders. The semi-arid climate west of the 98th meridian, roughly bisecting Kansas, Nebraska and the Dakotas, made traditional eastern farming practices ineffective. Annual rainfall averaged less than 20 inches, sometimes falling to half that amount during drought years. Summer temperatures could exceed 100 degrees, while winter blizzards brought temperatures far below zero, often with devastating winds. Weather extremes carried away both human and animal lives. The brutal winter of 1886-87, known as the Great Die-Up, devastated open-range cattle operations across the northern plains. Heavy snow, followed by freezing rain, created an impenetrable crust that prevented cattle from reaching the grass beneath. Temperatures remained below zero for weeks. When spring finally arrived, cattle carcasses littered the plains, with losses reaching 90% for some operators. One Montana rancher reported, "Before winter, I had 10,000 head. By spring, I could gather only 2,000. If it wasn't for the ravens circling, I couldn't even find the dead ones beneath the snowdrifts." This catastrophic winter transformed the cattle industry. The survivors abandoned open-range practices in favour of smaller, fenced operations with hay production for winter feeding. The era of vast unfenced ranges gave way to more intensive management, requiring greater capital investment. While cattle interests had initially dominated Western land use, farmers increasingly claimed prime territories along watercourses. The collision between these agricultural systems sparked some of the most bitter conflicts in Western history, the Range Wars. These disputes took different forms across the West, but generally pitted established cattle operations against homesteaders. In Wyoming's Johnson County War of 1892, cattle barons hired gunmen to eliminate alleged rustlers, most of whom were small ranchers and farmers. In Lincoln County, New Mexico, what began as a commercial rivalry between competing merchant ranchers escalated into a bloody conflict involving figures like Billy the Kid. In central Texas, fence-cutting wars erupted when barbed wire blocked traditional cattle trails and access to water sources. The invention of barbed wire in the 1870s revolutionized Western agriculture by providing an inexpensive fencing solution in regions without abundant timber. Patented by Joseph Glidden in 1874, this simple combination of twisted wires with attached barbs allowed effective enclosure of crops and livestock. Within a decade, millions of miles of barbed wire crisscrossed the West, fundamentally altering patterns of land use. Established cattle interests often resisted this transition, sometimes violently. Fence-cutting wars erupted in Texas when newly erected barriers blocked traditional cattle trails and access to water sources. Armed bands calling themselves Owls, Javelinas, or Blue Devils cut fences under cover of darkness, the Texas state legislature finally intervened in 1884, making fence cutting a felony, while also requiring gates every 3 miles on fenced roads and prohibiting enclosure of public lands. The resolution of these conflicts generally favoured agricultural settlement over ranching. The federal government's land policies explicitly encouraged farming, while technological developments made cultivation possible in previously marginal areas. New drought-resistant wheat varieties, dry farming techniques, and eventually gasoline-powered tractors and combines extended the viable farming frontier. Water rights became increasingly contentious as settlement intensified. The Eastern Riparian Doctrine, which granted water use to those owning adjacent land, proved impractical in arid regions. Western territories and states developed a new legal framework, prior appropriation, or first in time, first in right, that assigned water rights based on earliest beneficial use regardless of land ownership. This system facilitated irrigation projects but created complex legal hierarchies that continue to shape Western water policy. Large-scale irrigation transformed parts of the arid West into agricultural oases. Private companies initially built many irrigation systems, though financial limitations and engineering challenges led to increased government involvement. The Carey Act of 1894 granted federal lands to states for irrigation development, while the Reclamation Act of 1902 committed federal resources to major water projects. These initiatives would eventually create massive dams, reservoirs, and canal systems supporting millions of acres of irrigated farmland. Both ranching and farming frontiers faced recurring cycles of prosperity and hardship, driven by environmental conditions, market fluctuations, and changing technologies. The Great Bonanzas, periods when favorable weather and prices coincided, created brief windows of exceptional profits. More common were years of marginal returns punctuated by devastating losses during droughts, blizzards, or market collapses. Through these cycles, Western agriculture gradually shifted from purely extractive approaches toward more sustainable practices. Ranchers implemented rotational grazing, developed water sources, and cultivated hay meadows. Farmers experimented with summer fallowing, contour ploughing, and crop rotation to preserve soil moisture and fertility. These adaptations represented not just technical innovations but evolving relationships with the demanding landscape. The human diversity of these agricultural frontiers exceeded popular stereotypes. Beyond cowboys and homesteaders, the rural West included significant populations of Hispanic ranchers, maintaining traditions dating to Spanish colonial times. Black farmers establishing communities like Nicodemus, Kansas, Mormon agricultural colonies practicing cooperative irrigation, and various European immigrant groups adapting Old World farming techniques to New World conditions. Women's contributions proved essential to agricultural success, though often overlooked in popular accounts. Beyond domestic responsibilities, farm and ranch women typically managed poultry, gardens, and dairy operations, processed and preserved food, and participated in field work during crucial seasons. During men's absences for cattle drives or wage labour, women maintained full responsibility for farms and ranches, developing skills in everything from livestock care to equipment repair. By the century's end, both ranching and farming had evolved from frontier enterprises into established agricultural systems. Corporate organizations increasingly dominated cattle production, while successful farmers expanded beyond homestead boundaries through purchase of neighboring lands. The individualistic frontier gradually gave way to more structured communities, with established churches, schools, and commercial centers. What remained from the pioneer period was a distinctive relationship with the land, a blend of respect, struggle, and stewardship that acknowledged both the region's constraints and its possibilities. In letters, diaries, and reminiscences, those who lived through this era frequently described their experience in terms of partnership with the landscape rather than conquest. As Nebraska farmer Uriah Oblinger wrote in 1877, "We do not subdue this land so much as learn its ways. It teaches patience, reminds us of our limits, and occasionally grants abundance beyond all expectation." As the physical frontier of the American West gradually closed, another frontier opened, one built of ink, celluloid, and memory. While settlers wrestled with harsh environmental realities and complex social conflicts, a parallel process was unfolding in newspaper offices, publishing houses, and theatre stages across America and beyond. The West was being transformed from lived experience into legend, its complex realities distilled into powerful symbols that would captivate the American imagination for generations to come. This myth-making began even as the frontier experience was still unfolding. The men and women who would become larger-than-life icons of the Wild West, were often still alive when their first fictional counterparts appeared in print or on stage. Some actively participated in crafting their own legends, blurring the already thin line between historical reality and cultural myth. Few figures exemplify this transformation better than Jesse James. Born in Missouri in 1847, James came of age during the bitter border conflicts of Bleeding Kansas and served as a Confederate guerrilla under William Quantrill during the Civil War. When peace returned, James found himself unable or unwilling to adapt. Between 1866 and 1876, he and his brother Frank, along with the younger brothers, carried out a series of daring bank and train robberies across the Midwest. What distinguished Jesse from countless other outlaws was his genius for self-promotion. He cultivated relationships with friendly newspaper editors, particularly John Newman Edwards of the Kansas City Times, who portrayed the James Gang not as criminals, but as Confederate heroes continuing to resist Yankee oppression. "The James boys are not outlaws," Edwards wrote. "They are the victims of outlawry. They have never been convicted of any crime." This Robin Hood mythology, largely fabricated, portrayed Jesse as a defender of poor farmers against rapacious railroad barons and corrupt banks. In reality, the gang's robberies often targeted working-class messengers and clerks, and occasionally killed innocent bystanders. Yet the myth proved more powerful than reality. When Robert Ford shot Jesse James in the back on April 3, 1882, the outlaw was immortalized in folk ballads almost overnight. "The dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard has laid poor Jesse in his grave." The mythology surrounding Billy the Kid followed a similar pattern of transformation. Born Henry McCarty around 1859, the young man who would become Billy the Kid was a small-time rustler and gunman caught up in the Lincoln County War, a complex conflict mixing business rivalries with ethnic tensions in 1870s New Mexico territory. What made Billy extraordinary was not his criminal record, modest by frontier standards, but the media attention he received. After Billy escaped from jail and killed 2 deputies in April 1881, New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace placed a $500 bounty on his head. Sheriff Pat Garrett tracked and killed Billy in July of that year, then collaborated with journalist Ash Upson on a biography, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. Though wildly exaggerated, claiming Billy had killed 21 men, 1 for each year of his life, the book established the template for countless later retellings. "The most remarkable thing about these stories," noted one later historian, "is how little they resemble the actual life of Henry McCarty. The real Billy was neither the bloodthirsty psychopath of Garrett's account nor the romantic hero of later Hollywood films, just a troubled young man with quick reflexes and poor judgment, who became a blank canvas for others to paint their fantasies upon. While outlaws captured public imagination through their defiance of authority, equally mythologized were the lawmen who pursued them. Wyatt Earp spent just 30 months as a peace officer in Tombstone, Arizona. Yet these brief years, particularly the 30-second gunfight near the OK, Corral on October 26, 1881, would define his public image forever. After leaving Arizona, Earp spent nearly 5 decades working as a saloon keeper, mining speculator and sports referee, occasionally relating increasingly elaborate versions of his frontier exploits to admiring journalists. In 1931, 2 years after Earp's death, Stuart N. Lake published Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, a supposedly biographical account that Lake later admitted contained significant inventions. This portrayal of Earp as an incorruptible, almost superhuman lawman set the template for countless Western heroes in fiction and film. The messy realities, Earp's arrests for horse theft and brothel keeping, his questionable shootings, his complex business interests in the very gambling and prostitution he supposedly policed, disappeared beneath the weight of the heroic narrative. Bat Masterson followed a similar trajectory. After brief stints as sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, and marshal of Trinidad, Colorado, Masterson reinvented himself as a sports writer and boxing referee in New York City. There, his occasional reminiscences about frontier days grew increasingly colorful. By the time of his death in 1921, the mythical Masterson, cool-headed gunfighter with a hair-trigger temper, dandy dresser with lightning reflexes, had largely displaced the more complex historical figure. Female outlaws challenged gender expectations while creating their own legends. Belle Starr, born Myra Maybelle Shirley in Missouri, associated with various outlaw gangs in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, during the 1870s and 1880s. Though her actual criminal activities were relatively minor, mostly horse theft and harboring fugitives, newspapers dubbed her the Bandit Queen. After her unsolved murder in 1889, Richard K. Fox published a sensationalized biography, portraying Bell as a bloodthirsty outlaw leader, an image later reinforced through dime novels and Hollywood films. Pearl Hart achieved brief notoriety by robbing an Arizona stagecoach in 1899, one of the last recorded stagecoach robberies in American history. Though her criminal career consisted of this single hold-up, Pearl understood the power of myth-making. During her trial and imprisonment, she crafted a compelling narrative around her crime, claiming poverty had driven her to desperation. She posed for photographs dressed in men's clothing with a cigar in her mouth, embracing her outlaw image while playing to journalists' fascination with gender-bending frontier women. The press served as the essential vehicle transforming these real individuals into legendary figures. Newspaper correspondents, often based in eastern cities, travelled west seeking colourful stories that would captivate their readers. These journalists, with little oversight or fact-checking, blended actual events with rumours, exaggerations, and occasionally pure fiction. Telegraph technology enabled these stories to spread rapidly, creating national sensations around events like Custer's Last Stand or the capture of Geronimo. Publishers recognized the commercial potential in these Western narratives. Erastus Beadle revolutionized popular publishing with his introduction of the dime novel in 1860. These inexpensive paperbacks, with lurid covers depicting Indians, outlaws, and heroic frontiersmen, sold millions of copies. Ned Buntline, pen name of Edward Z.C. Judson, wrote hundreds of such works, including Buffalo Bill, the King of Border Men, 1869, which helped transform a relatively obscure army scout and buffalo hunter into a national celebrity. William F. Buffalo Bill. Cody recognized the commercial potential of Western mythology more clearly than anyone. After working as a Pony Express rider, scout, and buffalo hunter, Cody parlayed his frontier experiences into theatrical productions. His Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, first performed in 1883, grew into a massive enterprise touring America and Europe for 3 decades. The show featured sharpshooting exhibitions, mock Indian attacks on stagecoaches and settlers' cabins, and reenactments of famous battles. Cody brilliantly blended authenticity and spectacle. He recruited actual Lakota warriors, including Sitting Bull for one season, to portray hostile Indians in his shows. Real cowboys demonstrated roping and riding skills. Genuine frontier figures like Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok briefly joined his troupe. Yet these authentic elements were rearranged into simplified narratives that reinforced existing stereotypes. Brave pioneers, savage, though occasionally noble Indians, heroic cavalrymen, and the triumph of civilization over savagery. Annie Oakley became the show's most beloved performer after joining in 1885. Born Phoebe Ann Mosey in rural Ohio, Oakley had developed extraordinary shooting skills as a child hunting to feed her impoverished family. As Little Sure Shot in Buffalo Bill's show, she dazzled audiences by splitting playing cards edge-on at 30 paces and shooting cigarettes from her husband's lips. Queen Victoria of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and other European royalty marvelled at her performances during the show's international tours. For Native American performers, participation in these shows presented a complex bargain. Facing dire conditions on reservations after military defeat, many viewed show business as one of few economic opportunities available. Some, like Sitting Bull, used their earnings to benefit their impoverished communities. Others valued the opportunity to maintain horsemanship and other traditional skills that reservation policies often suppressed. Yet their participation also required performing in spectacles that caricatured their cultures and celebrated their defeat. Black Elk, a Lakota holy man who toured with Buffalo Bill as a young man, later reflected on this contradiction. I was an Oglala, and we never gave up our lands of our own free will, and so I thought that if I could go to that show and get paid something, I could save up enough money to buy some of our land back. The poignant irony of performing mock battles reenacting one's own people's defeat was not lost on these indigenous participants. As Buffalo Bill's troupe travelled through Europe, they spread a particular vision of the American frontier experience, simplified, romanticized, and sanitized of its more troubling aspects. European audiences developed a fascination with the American West that persists to this day, with Wild West clubs and Native American hobbyist groups still active across Germany, France, and other European countries. While Buffalo Bill created living tableaus of frontier mythology, visual artists were crafting equally influential images on canvas. Frederick Remington, who briefly experienced the West as a failed sheep rancher in Kansas before returning east, produced paintings, sculptures, and illustrations that defined the visual vocabulary of the frontier. His dramatic scenes of cavalry charges, bucking broncos, and stoic cowboys established a visual template that would influence Western imagery for generations. Charles M. Russell, unlike Remington, lived most of his life in the West, working as a cowhand in Montana before turning to art full-time. His paintings captured the working cowboy's life with an insider's eye for detail, yet even Russell's work contained elements of mythology, a nostalgic vision of a vanishing way of life, rather than a documentation of the often brutal, tedious reality of ranch work. As Russell himself wrote, "The West is dead, my friend, but I have lived in a time when it was in flower." Photography provided a seemingly more objective record of Western life, though even these images were shaped by the photographer's cultural assumptions and technical limitations. William Henry Jackson's striking landscape photographs helped convince Congress to establish Yellowstone as the first national park in 1872. Edward S. Curtis's monumental project, The North American Indian, comprising over 40,000 photographs taken between 1906 and 1930, created a vast visual record of indigenous cultures, though Curtis often removed modern elements from his compositions and dressed his subjects in traditional clothing they no longer wore daily, creating images of an imagined authentic indigenous life untouched by modern influences. Literary figures like Mark Twain brought the West to life through distinctive prose. Twain's Roughing It, 1872, recounted his experiences in Nevada during the silver boom with humour and skepticism toward frontier myth-making. "The truth is," Twain wrote, "that there was much about frontier life that was irritating and disagreeable. It did not have the qualities that captivating novels have invested it with." Despite such occasional correctives, the mythologizing of the West continued unabated. Owen Wister's novel The Virginian, 1902, established many conventions of the Western genre: the laconic hero with a mysterious past, the climactic showdown in a dusty street, the civilizing influence of the Eastern schoolmarm. Zane Grey's enormously popular novels, beginning with Riders of the Purple Sage, 1912, further codified these tropes for generations of readers. Lost in this myth-making were the diverse experiences of those who didn't fit the conventional Western narrative. Black cowboys, comprising perhaps 1/4 of all cowboys during the cattle drive era, largely disappeared from popular representations. The thousands of Chinese laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad, Mexican vaqueros who taught Anglo cowboys their trade, and Jewish merchants who established commercial networks throughout the frontier rarely appeared in the evolving mythology. Women's experiences were similarly distorted. The popular image of the passive, sun-bonneted pioneer wife ignored the reality of frontier women who ran businesses, homesteaded independently, and built institutions. Individuals like Biddy Mason, a formerly enslaved woman who became a wealthy Los Angeles landowner and philanthropist; Mary Fields, Stagecoach Mary, a formidable black woman who delivered mail in Montana; or Abigail Scott Duniway, who fought for women's suffrage throughout the Northwest, rarely found places in the masculine mythology of the frontier. Immigrant communities established vibrant settlements across the West. German farmers in Texas, Scandinavian homesteaders in Minnesota and the Dakotas, Chinese fishermen along the Pacific coast, Russian Moluccans in California's Central Valley. These diverse cultural influences shaped Western development as profoundly as the Anglo-American pioneers, who dominated frontier mythology. Yet their stories remained largely untold in popular representations. Perhaps most significantly, the mythologizing process often inverted historical cause and effect. In the popular narrative, the West represented untamed wilderness, where civilization gradually triumphed over savagery. The historical reality was more complex. Many areas being incorporated into the United States had existing governmental systems, whether indigenous political structures or Mexican municipal institutions. What appeared as lawlessness often represented conflict between competing legal and cultural frameworks, rather than an absence of order. By the early 20th century, the physical frontier had closed, but the mythological frontier continued expanding through new media. Western silent films like The Great Train Robbery, 1903, established conventions that would flourish in thousands of subsequent movies. Radio programs like The Lone Ranger, beginning in 1933, brought Western adventures into American living rooms. Television would later make the Western one of its dominant genres. This myth-making process transformed a complex historical period of cultural collision, environmental transformation, and rapid technological change into a simplified moral landscape, a canvas on which Americans projected their values and anxieties. The mythological West became a place where good and evil were clearly distinguished, where problems could be resolved through individual heroism, rather than collective action or institutional reform, and where American identity found its purest expression. The enduring power of these myths speaks to their deep resonance in American culture. The icons of the Wild West, the self-reliant cowboy, the desperate outlaw, the stoic lawman, continue to shape how Americans understand themselves. These symbols have proven remarkably adaptable, reinterpreted by each generation to address contemporary concerns while maintaining their connection to a romanticized past. The real West, a place of racial complexity, environmental challenges, economic exploitation, and cultural exchange, remains largely buried beneath the weight of these powerful myths, awaiting rediscovery by those willing to look beyond the legends to the more nuanced historical reality. As the United States emerged from the bloody crucible of civil war, its gaze turned westward with renewed intensity. The Transcontinental Railroad pushed through ancient hunting grounds, mining operations gouged minerals from sacred mountains, and cattle operations spread across traditional grazing lands. For the indigenous peoples who had called these territories home for countless generations, the decades following the Civil War represented a desperate struggle, not merely for land or resources, but for the very survival of their cultures, beliefs, and ways of life. Unlike the mythologized version of Western expansion that would later dominate popular imagination, the true story unfolded not as a simple march of civilization against savagery, but as a complex clash of fundamentally different worldviews about humanity's relationship with the land, with each other, and with the spiritual realm. Native resistance to this unprecedented wave of settlement took many forms, from armed conflict to legal challenges, from diplomatic negotiation to cultural adaptation. Their stories reveal not passive victims of historical forces, but active agents who made strategic choices in the face of overwhelming pressure. Among the most significant armed conflicts of this era, Red Cloud's War stands as a rare example of indigenous military success against American expansion. In 1866, the US government attempted to build a road, the Bozeman Trail, through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds in present-day Wyoming and Montana, connecting the Oregon Trail to the goldfields of Montana. This flagrant violation of earlier treaty promises ignited fierce resistance from a coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by the Oglala Lakota chief Red Cloud. Instead of engaging in open-field battles where army firepower would prove decisive, indigenous fighters employed guerrilla tactics, ambushing soldiers, attacking isolated outposts, and making the Bozeman Trail corridor so dangerous that travel became nearly impossible. The most dramatic confrontation came in December 1866, when Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors lured Captain William Fetterman and 80 soldiers into an ambush near Fort Phil Kearny. Convinced of his military superiority, Fetterman had boasted he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with just 80 men. His detachment was annihilated within minutes. Many arrows found their marks, recalled Wooden Leg, a Northern Cheyenne participant. The soldiers fell from their horses until all were on the ground. Many hand-to-hand fights followed. Soldiers who still lived were fighting with 6 shooters. The battle, which US newspapers called the Fetterman Massacre, shocked Eastern audiences with its decisive indigenous victory. After 2 years of fighting and mounting military and economic costs, the US government took the unprecedented step of suing for peace on indigenous terms. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty recognized Lakota sovereignty over the Great Sioux Reservation, encompassing the western half of present-day South Dakota and parts of neighboring states, while also acknowledging their hunting rights in the Powder River country further west. The army abandoned its forts along the Bozeman Trail, which Red Cloud's warriors ceremonially burned as they withdrew. This triumph proved short-lived. In 1874, an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer confirmed the presence of gold in the Black Hills, Pahasapa to the Lakota, the sacred heart of their territory protected by the Fort Laramie Treaty. When the government attempted to purchase the Black Hills, Lakota leaders refused. "The Black Hills belong to me," said Sitting Bull. "If the whites try to take them, I will fight." The discovery unleashed a flood of miners and settlers into treaty-protected lands, and the government made little effort to remove these trespassers. By 1876, tensions had escalated into the Great Sioux War. The army launched a 3-pronged campaign to force non-treaty bands, those refusing to settle on reservations, onto the diminished territories the government now expected them to accept. In June of that year, this strategy led to the most famous indigenous victory against US forces. At a place the Lakota called Greasy Grass along the Little Bighorn River, Custer's 7th Cavalry attacked a massive encampment of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho families. Vastly outnumbered and divided into vulnerable detachments, the soldiers faced a coordinated response from warriors led by Crazy Horse, Gall, and other war leaders. Custer and over 260 soldiers died in the fighting. A Lakota woman later recounted, "The dust rose like smoke from a great fire. We could see soldiers falling from their horses. Some tried to run away, but our warriors rode around them in circles until they killed them all." The victory at Little Bighorn, like Red Cloud's earlier success, proved Pyrrhic. Public outrage over Custer's last stand fueled calls for harsh retaliation. The army doubled its forces in the region, pursuing indigenous bands relentlessly through the winter of 1876-77. Food supplies dwindled, and one by one the bands were forced to surrender. The government seized the Black Hills and additional lands from the Great Sioux Reservation. By 1877, even the legendary Crazy Horse had surrendered, only to be killed months later while in army custody, stabbed with a bayonet under disputed circumstances that many Lakota viewed as deliberate murder. Not all resistance followed the pattern of the Northern Plains. In the Pacific Northwest, the Nez Perce had maintained generally peaceful relations with whites, since aiding Lewis and Clark decades earlier. In 1877, however, the government demanded they leave their ancestral homeland in the Wallowa Valley of Oregon for a much smaller reservation in Idaho. While some bands reluctantly agreed, Chief Joseph's band initially resisted. After a group of young men killed several white settlers in retaliation for earlier injustices, Joseph realized war was inevitable and led his people in a strategic retreat toward Canada. What followed was an extraordinary 170-mile fighting retreat across Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. Pursued by multiple army columns totaling thousands of soldiers, the roughly 700 Nez Perce, including only about 200 warriors, won a series of tactical victories or fought to stalemate before continuing their journey. Women, children, and elders travelled alongside the warriors, carrying what possessions they could save. The band's military skill astonished army officers. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who had helped win the Civil War through his devastating March to the Sea, praised the Nez Perce campaign as one of the most extraordinary Indian wars of which there is any record. The Nez Perce warriors consistently outmaneuvered their pursuers and demonstrated remarkable discipline and tactical awareness. The flight ended just 40 miles from the Canadian border in northern Montana. Exhausted, short on ammunition, and caught by fresh troops, Joseph surrendered with words that would become famous. "Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Despite promises of a return to the Pacific Northwest, Joseph and his people were sent to malaria-infested Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, where many died before survivors were eventually allowed to return to reservations in the Northwest, though never to their beloved Wallowa Valley. In the Southwest, resistance took a different form. The various Apache bands, including Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Western Apache, had long defended their homelands against Spanish, Mexican, and American encroachment. After the Civil War, the U.S. government attempted to concentrate these highly mobile people onto designated reservations. Those who refused were labeled hostiles and pursued by the military. Among the most effective resistance leaders was Geronimo, a Chiricahua Apache whose name would become synonymous with indigenous resistance. Though never a chief in the formal sense, Geronimo's spiritual power, tactical brilliance, and absolute refusal to accept reservation life inspired followers through decades of conflict. Operating from remote mountain strongholds in the borderlands between the United States and Mexico, Apache fighters conducted lightning raids before disappearing into terrain they knew intimately. Geronimo repeatedly agreed to settlement on reservations when conditions became too difficult, only to break away again when reservation conditions proved unbearable or promises were broken. During his final campaign in 1885-86, the U.S. government deployed 5,000 troops, a quarter of the entire U.S. Army, plus thousands of Mexican soldiers to capture Geronimo and his band of just 38 men, women, and children. This asymmetrical deployment highlighted both the effectiveness of Apache resistance tactics and the symbolic importance the government placed on subduing these last free-roaming bands. When Geronimo finally surrendered in 1886, he and his followers were sent first to Florida, then to Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, far from their southwestern homeland. The threat of Apache raids had been used to justify military presence throughout the Southwest, and with the removal of these last hostiles, that justification evaporated. 2 decades of conflict ended with entire communities displaced and traditional lifeways severely disrupted, but also with a legacy of resistance that would inspire future generations. Behind these dramatic military conflicts stood remarkable indigenous leaders who combined spiritual power, political acumen, and strategic thinking. Their leadership emerged from cultural traditions very different from European command structures, often blending spiritual authority with practical guidance rather than exercising direct control over followers. Perhaps no leader better exemplified this approach than Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota holy man who became the face of indigenous resistance for many Americans. Born around 1831, Sitting Bull distinguished himself as a warrior in his youth, but his greatest influence came through his role as a Wikasa Wakan, a holy man or spiritual leader. His visions guided his people during the critical years of conflict, including a famous Sundance vision before the Little Bighorn battle, in which he saw soldiers falling into camp upside down, presaging Custer's defeat. Sitting Bull understood the threat posed by American expansion in both physical and spiritual terms. The white man knows how to make everything, he once observed, but he does not know how to distribute it. The love of possession is a disease with them. After years of resistance, including a period of exile in Canada, Sitting Bull eventually settled on the Standing Rock Reservation, where he continued advocating for his people until his death in 1890 at the hands of Indian police sent to arrest him during the Ghost Dance Panic. While Sitting Bull provided spiritual leadership, Crazy Horse embodied the warrior tradition at its most effective. Born in the 1840s, this Oglala Lakota war leader was known for his courage, tactical brilliance, and unwavering commitment to traditional life ways. Unlike some leaders who visited Washington or engaged directly with white officials, Crazy Horse refused to learn English or adopt any aspects of European culture. His spiritual practices included solitary vision quests that reinforced his commitment to protecting his people's way of life. As a military tactician, Crazy Horse developed innovative approaches that neutralized the advantages of US forces. He mastered the technique of drawing soldiers into terrain where their formations and firearms provided less advantage, as demonstrated perfectly at the Little Bighorn. His leadership style was democratic rather than authoritarian. He led by example and persuasion, never by command. Warriors followed him because of his proven abilities and spiritual power, not from any formal authority. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, though often portrayed as primarily a war leader, was actually more significant as a diplomat and spokesman. Born Hinmatu Evialatket, thunder rolling down the mountain, he inherited leadership from his father who had counselled, "Never sell the bones of your father and your mother." Joseph's eloquence in defending his people's rights impressed even his adversaries. Unlike Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, Joseph engaged directly with American legal and political systems, even travelling to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Rutherford B. Hayes to advocate for his people's return to their homeland. The resistance these leaders mounted represented not merely military strategy but cultural defence. As they understood clearly, the government's goal was not simply to acquire land but to transform indigenous peoples into facsimiles of European Americans, to kill the Indian to save the man, as Captain Richard Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, infamously phrased it. This cultural assault found its primary expression in the reservation system. Initially conceived as temporary spaces where indigenous peoples would be concentrated while learning agriculture and other skills deemed necessary for assimilation, reservations quickly became permanent institutions of control and cultural suppression. The physical spaces designated for these purposes typically represented drastic reductions from traditional territories and often featured marginal lands unsuited for the agricultural practices the government insisted residents adopt. Daily life on early reservations was marked by profound disruption. Traditional leadership structures were undermined by the appointment of government agents who controlled nearly every aspect of community life. These agents, often political appointees with little knowledge of the cultures they supervised, wielded nearly absolute power. They controlled food rations, permission to leave the reservation, and even religious practices. Corruption plagued the system from its inception. Congressional investigations repeatedly documented agents who skimmed government resources, accepted shoddy goods from contractors, or undercounted reservation populations to pocket the difference in allocated supplies. The infamous Indian Ring of the Grant administration represented just one example of systemic corruption that left many reservation residents facing malnutrition and inadequate shelter. "We lived on rabbits and roots," recalled Standing Bear, a Ponca leader, describing life after his people were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory. "Many of our people sickened and died, and all of us suffered hunger. We did not understand the language or the ways of that place. Religious and cultural suppression formed another pillar of reservation policy. Traditional ceremonies like the sun dance were banned as savage superstitions. Children were sent to distant boarding schools designed explicitly to strip away indigenous identity. Traditional healers were threatened with imprisonment for practicing their arts. Native languages were forbidden in government schools, with children physically punished for speaking their mother tongues. Perhaps most devastating was the deliberate assault on traditional economic systems. Buffalo herds, the foundation of plains cultures, were systematically destroyed, both to undermine indigenous independence and to clear the plains for cattle operations. On many reservations, tools and training promised by treaties arrived late, if at all. When harvest failed on unfamiliar and often marginal lands, residents became utterly dependent on government rations, creating cycles of dependency that undermined traditional self-sufficiency. The legal structure supporting this system evolved through unilateral government action. The end of treaty-making in 1871 meant indigenous nations lost their status as sovereign entities with whom the United States negotiated as equals. Instead, Congress simply legislated policies without consultation. The Supreme Court's contradictory rulings recognized tribal sovereignty in some contexts, while simultaneously affirming Congress's plenary power to override that sovereignty at will. Yet amid these crushing pressures, indigenous peoples developed remarkable strategies of resistance and adaptation. Their responses range from armed resistance to legal challenges, from revitalization movements to selective adaptation of new technologies and practices that might strengthen their communities. Cultural resilience took many forms. Ceremonies banned by government agents went underground, performed in remote locations or disguised as acceptable activities. The sun dance, though officially prohibited until the 1930s, continued in modified forms or was performed secretly beyond the agent's scrutiny. Traditional healing practices, kinship systems, and oral traditions were maintained within families and communities, despite official suppression. Women played crucial roles in this cultural preservation, often receiving less scrutiny from agents than male leaders. Grandmothers taught children tribal languages while parents were away working. Traditional foods were prepared alongside government rations, maintaining both nutritional knowledge and ceremonial practices associated with gathering and preparing these foods. Songs, stories, and artistic traditions continued in household settings beyond the reach of direct government control. Adaptation strategies varied by region and tribe. Some communities selectively incorporated European technologies and practices that strengthened rather than undermined their cultures. The Navajo, for instance, expanded their traditional weaving with wool from sheep introduced by Europeans, developing new patterns and techniques that became economically valuable while remaining culturally distinctive. Similarly, Plains artists adapted new materials like ledger books and colored pencils to continue visual storytelling traditions when buffalo hides became scarce. Political organization evolved to meet new challenges. Tribal councils, though initially imposed by government authorities, were gradually transformed into vehicles for expressing community concerns and defending remaining rights. Indigenous leaders learned to navigate American legal and political systems, filing lawsuits, petitioning Congress, and forming pan-tribal organizations to address common grievances. The Society of American Indians, founded in 1911, represented an early example of educated indigenous people using American institutions to challenge policies affecting their communities. Economic adaptation proved especially challenging given the deliberate destruction of traditional subsistence patterns. Some communities developed new economic niches. The Navajo expanded their livestock operations. Puebloan peoples found markets for pottery and other crafts, and individuals mastered trades from blacksmithing to carpentry. These economic innovations provided some measure of independence from government control while maintaining communal values at odds with the individualistic capitalism the civilization program sought to impose. Religious innovations offered another response to cultural crisis. The most significant of these, the ghost dance movement, emerged in the late 1880s in response to the catastrophic conditions facing indigenous communities. Wovoka, a Paiute spiritual leader also known as Jack Wilson, experienced a powerful vision during a solar eclipse in January 1889. In this vision, he was taken to the spirit world and given a message of hope. If Indian people performed a specific dance and lived by certain moral precepts, they would be reunited with their deceased relatives, the buffalo would return, and settler society would vanish or be transformed. This powerful message spread rapidly across the western reservations, offering hope to communities facing desperate conditions. The ghost dance represented not merely escapism, but a profound assertion of indigenous spiritual power in response to overwhelming pressure. Practitioners understood the dance as actively bringing about the promised transformation through spiritual means when physical resistance had failed. Each tribe adapted the basic elements of the ghost dance to fit their own cultural traditions. Among the Lakota, the movement took on a particularly militant character under the leadership of Short Bull and Kicking Bear, who added elements like ghost shirts, garments believed to protect wearers from bullets. As thousands of Lakota began performing the dance on reservations across South Dakota in 1890, government agents grew increasingly alarmed at what they perceived as a potential uprising. This alarm came against a backdrop of severe deprivation. The government had recently reduced rations on Lakota reservations as punishment for resistance to a land cession agreement. The winter of 1890 brought blizzards and extreme cold. Hunger was widespread. Agent James McLaughlin at Standing Rock reported that ghost dance participants were reduced to skin and bones from hunger and exhaustion from dancing. Rather than addressing these conditions, authorities responded with military force. In December 1890, thousands of troops moved onto the Lakota reservations. After Sitting Bull was killed during a botched arrest attempt, many of his followers fled to join Chief Bigfoot's band, which was seeking safety at the Pine Ridge Reservation. On December 28th, the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, intercepted Bigfoot's band at Wounded Knee Creek. The following morning, as soldiers attempted to disarm the Lakota, a shot was fired. Accounts differ on whether it came from a deaf tribesman resisting the confiscation of his valuable rifle, or from a nervous soldier. Regardless of its origin, this shot triggered a devastating response. The cavalry opened fire with small arms and Hotchkiss mountain guns capable of firing 50 explosive rounds per minute. "We tried to run," recalled survivor Louise Weaselbear, "but they shot us like we were buffalo. I know there are some good white people, but the soldiers must be mean to shoot children and women." The official death toll listed 146 Lakota killed, though many survivors believed the true number exceeded 300, as bodies were carried away by relatives or lost in the 3-day blizzard that followed. Just 25 soldiers died, many likely from friendly fire in the chaotic close-quarters shooting. When spring came, photographer George Traeger documented the aftermath. A mass grave on the frozen hill where bodies had been hastily buried by a military burial detail. His images of twisted, snow-covered corpses threw into stark relief the reality behind the government's civilization rhetoric. The Wounded Knee massacre represented the bloody culmination of decades of policy aimed at eliminating indigenous resistance to American expansion. Yet even this devastating event did not mark the end of indigenous endurance. Standing on the ridge above the mass grave, Black Elk, who had witnessed the massacre as a young man, later reflected, "I did not know then how much was ended. When I look back now from this high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the crooked gulch as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. But while a certain dream may have died at Wounded Knee, the people themselves did not. Despite predictions of their inevitable disappearance, Native Americans persisted through the difficult decades that followed. The 20th century would bring new challenges: land allotment that reduced tribal holdings by 2/3, boarding schools that separated generations of children from their families, and poverty that seemed intractable. Yet it would also bring remarkable resurgence, as indigenous peoples found new ways to maintain their identities, reclaim their rights, and revitalize their cultures. The legacy of resistance leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Chief Joseph and Geronimo would inspire later generations of indigenous activists. Their struggles remind us that the story of the American West is not simply one of inevitable progress, but a complex narrative of cultural collision, resistance, adaptation, and survival against overwhelming odds. The indigenous peoples who fought to maintain their ways of life understood something profound about the land and humanity's relationship to it. Understandings that would be largely overlooked in the frenzied rush of conquest, but which would endure in communities that refused to disappear despite the most determined efforts to erase them. As native peoples struggled against displacement and fought to preserve their cultures, another story was unfolding across the same contested landscapes: the creation of new systems of law, governance, and political order. The chaotic rush of settlement had brought together people from wildly different backgrounds, with no shared history or established authority. In this vacuum, Western communities faced an urgent question: how would justice be maintained and order established in lands so recently claimed? In the earliest mining camps and frontier settlements, formal law barely existed. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in 1848, California still operated under Mexican law, but with Mexican authorities gone and American courts not yet established, miners created their own legal systems on the spot. They gathered in open-air meetings, voted on basic rules for claim sizes and water rights, and established procedures for resolving disputes. These miners' courts represented direct democracy in its rawest form, sometimes just and measured, other times swift and merciless. When crime occurred in these isolated communities, justice often came through vigilante action. In San Francisco, the famous vigilance committees of 1851 and 1856 took control of the city when residents lost faith in corrupt officials. They held trials, hanged those they found guilty, and banished others from the community. In Montana mining camps of the 1860s, vigilantes tracked and executed dozens of suspected road agents. One participant later justified their actions. "We had no law, but we had a community to protect and a sense of justice to guide us." Yet vigilante justice proved a dangerous substitute for formal law. Without consistent procedures or rights for the accused, innocent people sometimes died. Vigilance often became a tool for ethnic or personal vendettas. In Texas, hundreds of Mexicans and Mexican Americans were killed by Anglo vigilantes during the late 19th century, often under mere suspicion of cattle theft or other crimes. The transition to formal legal systems came gradually. As territories organized, Congress appointed judges who traveled vast circuits, holding court wherever they could find a suitable building. In Fort Smith, Arkansas, Judge Isaac Parker, later known as the Hanging Judge, presided over 74,000 square miles of Indian Territory from 1875 to 1896. His court tried thousands of cases and sentenced 160 people to death. Though portrayed as merciless in popular accounts, Parker saw himself as bringing predictable justice to a lawless region, noting, "The object of all punishment is the protection of society." Territorial courts operated under peculiar constraints. Judges were political appointees, often sent from eastern states with little understanding of western conditions. They answered to Congress rather than local voters. Appeals required expensive journeys to distant federal courts. In the courtrooms themselves, proceedings might reflect the roughness of the frontier. Lawyers could be self-taught, witnesses intimidating, and juries composed entirely of property-owning white men. In addition to these courts, a patchwork of other legal authorities developed. Federal marshals and their deputies pursued fugitives across vast territories. County sheriffs exercised local authority, sometimes with little oversight. Private detective agencies like Pinkerton's were hired by wealthy interests to protect property and break strikes. This layered, sometimes competing system of enforcement reflected the complexity of Western development and the absence of clear jurisdiction in many areas. The West experimented with imprisonment as well. Territorial prisons like Nevada State Prison, 1862, and Wyoming Territorial Prison, 1872, were established to house convicted criminals, though conditions inside these institutions were often brutal. Labor contracts sometimes allowed private companies to use prison labor, creating incentives for corrupt officials to increase convictions. Indigenous people convicted in federal courts faced particular hardship, sent to distant facilities where no one spoke their language and cultural practices were forbidden. As legal systems matured, Western courts established precedents that would shape American jurisprudence. Water law in the arid West developed the principle of prior appropriation. First use established first right, replacing the Eastern riparian doctrine that tied water rights to land ownership. Mining law recognized claims established by actual use rather than formal land titles. These adaptations to Western conditions demonstrated the pragmatic innovations that frontier communities could produce when Eastern models proved inadequate. The political evolution of Western territories followed a pattern established by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Newly acquired lands were first organized as territories with appointed governors, judges, and secretaries, all selected by the President and confirmed by the Senate. A territorial legislature elected by local voters handled local matters, but Congress could override their decisions, and the appointed governor held veto power. This semi-colonial system created constant tension. Territorial residents, particularly those who'd come west seeking greater freedom and opportunity, chafed under the authority of appointed carpetbaggers from the east. Wyoming Territory's Governor John Campbell complained that he was regarded as a foreign potentate sent to rule over a conquered province. Corruption flourished in this environment. The so-called Santa Fe Ring in New Mexico Territory, a network of lawyers, businessmen, and officials, manipulated land grants, government contracts, and Indian policy for personal gain for decades. Similar corrupt networks operated in other territories, exploiting the distance from Washington oversight and the power vacuum created by rapid development. The path from territory to state typically required population growth, economic development, and political negotiation. Nevada achieved statehood in just 3 years, 1861-1864, largely because its silver resources were valuable to the Union during the Civil War. New Mexico waited 62 years, 1850-1912, delayed by Eastern concerns about its predominantly Hispanic Catholic population and perceived political unreliability. For most territories, statehood campaigns became exercises in political image-making. Territorial leaders needed to convince Congress that their region was sufficiently American, populated by respectable Anglo-settlers, economically viable, and committed to Republican values. This process disadvantaged territories with large indigenous or Hispanic populations, which faced longer waits and more stringent requirements. The politics of the Western territories and early states defied simple categorization. Party loyalties reflected both national divisions and local concerns. Republicans, as the party of Lincoln and Emancipation, dominated areas settled by Union veterans and New Englanders. Democrats found support in mining regions with their large immigrant populations and areas with Confederate sympathizers. But Western voters often crossed party lines to support candidates who promised to protect regional interests against Eastern control. One striking political innovation emerged from the Western territories: women's suffrage. Wyoming Territory granted women full voting rights in 1869, followed by Utah Territory in 1870. When Wyoming applied for statehood, Congress threatened to revoke women's suffrage, but the territorial legislature famously replied, "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without the women." Congress backed down, and Wyoming entered as the first state with women's suffrage in 1890. By 1914, all Western states had enfranchised women, while most Eastern states still restricted voting to men. This Western leadership on suffrage reflected several factors. The relative scarcity of women in frontier communities enhanced their social value and independence. Western states competed for female settlers, offering political rights as incentive, and pragmatic considerations mattered. In Utah, Mormon leaders supported women's suffrage partly to increase their community's political power against federal control. The relationship between federal authority and local governance remained contentious throughout Western development. Federal land policy directly shaped settlement patterns through the Homestead Act of 1862 and subsequent legislation. The General Land Office, with its network of local offices, controlled the disposition of millions of acres. Land office agents wielded enormous power, and corruption was common. A Minnesota newspaper observed, "If there is a land office in the United States where there is not a first-class steel, it is not on the map." Federal authority extended through other agencies as well. The post office connected isolated communities through mail service, often serving as the most visible federal presence in remote areas. Army posts brought federal troops, payrolls, and contractors. Indian agents controlled reservations, managing annuity payments and enforcing assimilation policies. Together, these federal employees created a significant government presence even in supposedly ungoverned frontier regions. Western communities often maintained ambivalent attitudes toward federal power, resenting outside control while simultaneously demanding federal investment in roads, irrigation projects, and Indian removal. This tension between desire for autonomy and need for assistance characterized much of Western political discourse. The late 19th century saw various reform movements reshape Western politics. The Farmers' Alliance and later the Populist Party organized agricultural communities against what they saw as exploitation by railroads, banks, and Eastern capital. The Grange established cooperative buying and selling organizations while advocating for regulation of railroad rates. Labor unions formed among miners and railroad workers, fighting for improved wages and working conditions, sometimes through violent confrontations like the Cripple Creek Strike of 1894. Temperance campaigns gained particular strength in Western communities where saloons dominated social life. Women's organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union argued that alcohol abuse endangered family stability and squandered wages. Many Western towns enacted local prohibition long before national legislation. Conservation emerged as another powerful reform movement. As timber companies clear-cut forests and hydraulic mining devastated watersheds, advocates like John Muir called for preservation of Western landscapes. The establishment of Yellowstone as the world's first national park in 1872 marked an early victory, though tensions between conservation and development would continue to define Western politics. By the dawn of the 20th century, the American West had developed sophisticated legal and political institutions that reflected both the adoption of Eastern models and adaptation to Western conditions. The region's distinctive political culture, combining libertarian instincts with pragmatic acceptance of government authority in certain domains, would continue to influence national politics long after the frontier itself had disappeared. As law and politics established the framework of Western society, the texture of everyday life wove itself into patterns both colourful and complex. Beyond the grand narratives of empire building and territorial conflict, unfolded the ordinary yet extraordinary business of living, working, playing, worshipping, learning, and creating homes in a landscape that could be both breathtakingly beautiful and unforgivingly harsh. Here, on porches and in parlours, in saloons and schoolhouses, in churches and dance halls, the true story of the American West took shape in countless individual lives. The saloon stands as perhaps the most iconic institution of Western social life. Far more than merely a place to drink, these establishments served as the community living room, especially in towns too new or too small to have built proper civic institutions. Within their walls, men found refuge from the isolation of ranching or mining life, gained access to information through newspapers and conversation, conducted business deals, and occasionally witnessed or participated in the conflicts that would later be dramatized in countless Western tales. In a new mining camp, recalled one Montana resident, the first substantial building was invariably the saloon. Before we had a church, a school, or even a proper store, we had two saloons. One served as courthouse, community centre, and on Sundays with the bar draped in cloth as our church. The other housed the town's only piano and became our opera house and dance hall. The physical arrangement of these establishments followed a common pattern. A long bar along one wall, a large mirror behind it reflecting the room, and allowing patrons to watch the door without turning their backs. Gaming tables scattered throughout, and perhaps a small stage for entertainment. In more established towns, saloons might specialise, some catering to wealthy patrons with carpeted floors and crystal glassware, others serving working men with sawdust-covered planking and basic accommodations. Gambling provided both entertainment and the possibility of swift financial change in a region where fortunes could appear or vanish overnight. Poker, faro, monte, and keno attracted players to felt-covered tables, where the soft shuffling of cards and clicking of chips created a soundtrack for dreams of easy wealth. Professional gamblers moved through Western communities, recognizable by their neat attire and careful manners, their livelihood dependent on skill, psychology, and sometimes deception. "I never considered it gambling," explained one professional card player. "The other fellows were gambling. I was working. I knew the odds, studied my opponents, and waited for opportunity." Like any business, some days were profitable, others weren't. But in the long run, mathematics favoured the house or the professional who understood probabilities. Beyond cards and dice, Western communities created diverse entertainments. Travelling theatre troupes brought Shakespeare and melodrama to mining camps and cattle towns. Famous actors like Edwin Booth performed classical roles for surprisingly appreciative audiences of miners and cowboys. Lecturers, musicians, and novelty acts moved along established circuits, bringing glimpses of the wider world to isolated communities. Local entertainments thrived as well. Horse racing drew enthusiastic crowds and betting. Community dances, often called fandangos in the Southwest, brought people together across remarkable distances. One Colorado woman recalled her family traveling 30 miles by wagon to attend a dance, staying through the night and returning home the next day. For young people especially, these gatherings provided rare opportunities for courtship under the watchful eyes of community elders. Music permeated Western life in various forms. Mexican ballads, African American spirituals, European folk traditions, and Native American songs blended and influenced each other. The cowboy ballad tradition, with its themes of work, tragedy, and landscapes, emerged from this musical melting pot. Instruments were precious possessions. A fiddle, guitar, or accordion might be the most valuable non-practical item a settler owned, carried carefully across plains and mountains to provide comfort in the new land. Sports and athletic competitions fostered both entertainment and community bonding. Baseball spread rapidly across the West, with mining camps and small towns forming teams that competed fiercely for local pride. Shooting competitions showcased marksmanship skills that were both practical necessities and valued cultural achievements. Native American communities maintained traditional games and sports, sometimes adapting them for competitions with settlers. Alongside these amusements, religious institutions established footholds in even the most seemingly unpromising Western locations. Circuit-riding preachers traversed vast territories, holding services in homes, saloons, or open fields before moving to the next settlement. These religious figures often served multiple functions, bringing news, carrying mail, performing marriages, burying the dead, and offering counsel and comfort in communities without formal church buildings. Methodist circuit rider Peter Cartwright described his Kentucky and Tennessee ministry. "I have traveled through wilderness where I had to swim my horse across creeks or rivers 20 times a day, sleep on the ground with saddle for pillow and saddle blanket for covering, listening to wolves howl and panthers scream through the night, all to bring the gospel to those who otherwise would never hear it." As communities grew more established, permanent church buildings rose, often representing the first significant architectural statement in young settlements. These structures served not only as houses of worship but as community gathering places, schools, and centers for social services. Church congregations organized aid for the sick or bereaved, established orphanages, and created some of the first formalized charitable systems in Western communities. Religious diversity characterized the frontier from its earliest settlement. Mainstream Protestant denominations, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, competed for souls across the Western landscape. Catholics maintained strong presence in former Spanish territories and established influential mission networks. Jewish merchants and professionals established congregations in cities and mining towns, building synagogues from Denver to San Francisco. Mormons created their distinctive communities throughout the Great Basin. Chinese immigrants maintained Buddhist and Taoist traditions, building temples that stood as architectural counterpoints to the Christian churches dominating Western skylines. This diversity sometimes led to competition and conflict. Protestant missionaries viewed Catholic influence in the Southwest as a challenge to be overcome. Both Catholic and Protestant groups sought to convert Native Americans from traditional spiritual practices. Anti-Chinese sentiment often took the form of attacks on heathen religious practices, yet the practical necessities of Western life frequently moderated such tensions, with communities cooperating across denominational lines in times of hardship. Religious institutions also drove moral reform efforts throughout the region. Temperance campaigns sought to counter the influence of saloons, with women often leading these movements. The Women's Christian Temperance Union established chapters across the West, advocating not just prohibition but women's rights, labor reform, and public health initiatives. Anti-prostitution crusades targeted the red light districts that emerged in mining and railroad towns. Sabbatarian movements attempted to limit business and recreation on Sundays, though with limited success in communities where 7-day work weeks were common. The story of Western education reflects a remarkable commitment to learning despite daunting obstacles. The one-room schoolhouse, that potent symbol of frontier education, represented a significant community investment. These simple structures, often built through collective labor and funded by local subscription before formal tax systems were established, brought literacy and basic knowledge to children across the region. Inside these humble buildings, teachers, often young unmarried women from eastern states, faced extraordinary challenges. Classes might include children from 6 to 16 years old, with widely varying abilities and previous education. Teaching materials were scarce, with students sometimes sharing a handful of textbooks or writing on slate boards when paper was unavailable. The school term adjusted to agricultural rhythms, with shorter sessions during planting and harvest when children's labor was needed at home. "I had 32 pupils ages 5 to 17, wrote Kansas teacher Emma Adkins in 1874. The older boys came only during winter months. Some children walked 4 miles each way daily. We had 7 books for the entire school, so I wrote lessons on the blackboard and had students copy them. When the temperature fell below 0, we burned whatever fuel parents could provide, sometimes cow dung when wood was scarce, and kept our coats on while reciting lessons." Despite these challenges, literacy rates in Western territories often exceeded those in eastern states by the late 19th century. The value placed on education led communities to establish schools remarkably early in their development, sometimes before permanent housing was available for all residents. Educational opportunity was seen as essential to the promise of Western life, the chance for self-improvement and advancement that had drawn many settlers westward. Higher education similarly reflected this commitment to learning. State universities established through land grant funding created academic institutions across the region. Religious denominations founded colleges to serve their communities and train clergy. By 1900, the West boasted educational institutions that would eventually rank among the nation's finest, from Berkeley to Boulder, from Austin to Eugene. Intellectual life extended beyond formal education. Library associations formed even in small settlements, pooling resources to purchase books shared among members. Literary societies gathered for discussions of classic and contemporary works. Local newspapers, sometimes remarkably sophisticated in content despite humble production methods, provided not just news but essays, poetry, and serialized fiction. These newspapers played crucial roles in Western communities. Beyond providing information, they helped create shared identity and purpose in settlements composed of people from diverse origins. Editors wielded significant influence, shaping public opinion on issues from municipal improvements to national politics. The press simultaneously connected Western communities to national conversations while fostering distinctive regional perspectives and concerns. Scientific exploration and documentation flourished as well. Government surveys mapped territories and catalogued natural resources. Botanical expeditions identified and classified Western flora. Archaeological investigations examined ancient indigenous sites. Local scientific societies formed in large communities, with members conducting field studies and corresponding with Eastern and European scientific organizations. The cultural landscape of the West was enriched immeasurably by its diverse communities. In Western mining towns, Chinese neighborhoods, often called Chinatowns, created distinctive spaces with their own commercial, social, and religious institutions. These communities maintained traditional practices while adapting to new circumstances, establishing businesses that served both Chinese and non-Chinese customers. Despite facing severe discrimination, including restrictive legislation and occasionally violent attacks, Chinese immigrants created enduring cultural enclaves that influenced the broader Western society. Mexican-American communities throughout the Southwest maintained cultural continuity, despite the political changes following American annexation. Traditional village structures, religious practices, agricultural techniques, and craft traditions continued, even as these communities incorporated elements of Anglo culture. Spanish remained the primary language in many settlements, with bilingualism emerging gradually through commerce and education. European immigrants established communities that preserved distinctive cultural identities while participating in the broader Western society. German settlements in Texas, Scandinavian farming communities in Minnesota and the Dakotas, Basque sheep herders in Idaho and Nevada, Italian vineyard workers in California. Each group maintained elements of their heritage through language, food, music, and communal celebrations while adapting to their new environment. African American communities established themselves throughout the West, sometimes in all-black towns like Nicodemus, Kansas, where settlers sought not just economic opportunity, but escape from Southern racial oppression. These exodusters, as they were sometimes called, created farms, businesses, churches, and schools, building communities where they could exercise greater autonomy and self-determination than was possible in the post-Reconstruction South. Material culture, the physical objects and spaces of daily life, reveals much about Western adaptation and innovation. Housing evolved dramatically based on available materials and environmental demands. Settlers arriving from wooded eastern regions had to adapt when faced with treeless plains. Sod houses, built from blocks of prairie turf cut and stacked like bricks, provided effective shelter on the Great Plains. With walls several feet thick, these soddies offered excellent insulation against both summer heat and winter cold, though their dirt roofs leaked during heavy rains and harboured insects and small animals. As resources permitted, families replaced these temporary dwellings with more permanent structures. Lumber imported by railroad enabled frame construction in previously treeless areas. Mail-order house kits from companies like Sears, Roebuck provided standardized designs that could be assembled by local carpenters or ambitious homeowners. In the Southwest, traditional adobe construction techniques continued, with Anglo settlers often adopting these methods for their environmental efficiency. Clothing similarly adapted to Western conditions. Practical innovations like the cowboy hat, with its wide brim protecting against sun and rain, and chaps, leather coverings protecting riders' legs from brush and thorns, evolved from functional needs. Women's fashion maintained connections to Eastern styles while incorporating practical modifications for frontier conditions. Indigenous clothing designs influenced Western wear, particularly in items like moccasins and fringed leather garments. Food preparation reflected both cultural traditions and environmental adaptations. Dutch ovens, cast-iron skillets, and reflector ovens allowed cooking over open fires or in fireplaces. Preservation techniques, Smoking, drying, pickling, and canning remained essential in communities distant from regular supply sources. Regional foodways emerged, blending techniques and ingredients from diverse cultural traditions. Hispanic chilies and tortillas, German sausages, Chinese stir-fry methods, and Native American preparations of local plants and game. Home manufacturing continued to be essential, even as commercially produced goods became more available. Women produced textiles, spinning, weaving, knitting, and sewing to clothe their families. Men crafted furniture, tools, and agricultural implements. These practical skills represented not just economic necessity, but cultural values of self-sufficiency and resourcefulness that became defining elements of Western identity. Technological adoption occurred unevenly across the region. By the late 19th century, mail-order catalogues brought the products of eastern factories to remote ranches and farms. Sewing machines, mechanical reapers, windmills for pumping water, and eventually telephones transformed daily life for those who could afford them. Yet traditional methods persisted alongside these innovations, with many tasks still performed by hand and muscle power well into the 20th century. The material world of the West thus represented neither simple primitivism nor complete modernization, but a complex blend of adaptation, innovation, and tradition. Settlers combined elements from their various cultural backgrounds with practical responses to new environments, creating distinctive regional patterns that defined Western communities. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, social and cultural life in the West increasingly connected to national patterns while maintaining regional distinctiveness. The isolation that had shaped earlier frontier communities diminished as railroads, telegraph lines, and eventually telephones and automobiles linked Western settlements to each other and to the broader nation. Mass-produced goods, national publications, and standardized education created shared experiences across geographic divides. Yet the legacy of frontier conditions continued to influence Western cultural life, fostering values of independence, practicality, and community cooperation that would long outlast the actual frontier period. The social institutions and cultural patterns established during these formative decades created foundations for Western identity that remain visible in regional distinctions to this day. As we've journeyed across vast landscapes of mountain and prairie, through boomtowns and battlefields, our story has largely followed the paths of men, the cowboys, miners, soldiers, and outlaws whose exploits fill conventional tales of the American frontier. Yet threading through this tapestry, often less visible but no less vital, were the women whose courage, labour, and determination proved equally essential in shaping the West. Their stories reveal a frontier experience both similar to and profoundly different from that of their male counterparts. The journey west itself posed the first great challenge. Women faced the same physical hardships as men. The bone-jarring wagon rides, scorching heat, violent storms, and threat of illness, while typically bearing additional burdens. Many made the crossing while pregnant or nursing small children. They washed clothes in rivers along the trail, prepared meals over temperamental campfires, and tended the sick with limited supplies. Yet these practical responsibilities represented only the surface of their experience. It was not the physical hardships that weighed heaviest, wrote Nebraska settler Martha Stowell in her journal, but the tearing away from all that was familiar and dear. The men had their grand adventure, their eyes fixed on the promise ahead. We women counted the cost in family connections severed, in children's graves left behind unmarked on the prairie, in the comfortable routines of community abandoned for uncertain wilderness. Despite these emotional tolls, women often found themselves making critical decisions on the journey. When rivers needed crossing, sickness struck, or supplies ran short, their practical assessments frequently determined the party's course. While men might be the official leaders of wagon trains, women's influence shaped countless daily choices that meant the difference between success and disaster. Once established in their Western homes, women confronted the staggering labour of creating domestic space in wilderness conditions. A settler's cabin or sod house required constant attention, dirt floors to be swept, leaking roofs to be patched, walls to be chinked against winter winds. Water had to be hauled, often from considerable distances. Soap, candles, and other necessities were home manufactured rather than store-bought. These domestic tasks fell almost exclusively to women, who performed them alongside agricultural work, tending gardens and caring for livestock. The isolation of frontier homesteads exacted a particular toll. Lucy Henderson, who settled in Oregon's Willamette Valley in the 1850s, later recalled, "The silence was what haunted me most. Days would pass without the sight of another human face besides those in my own household. I would stand at our cabin door and look out across the valley with such a hunger for female companionship that it felt like a physical pain in my chest. Women developed strategies to combat this isolation. Letter writing became a lifeline, with mail eagerly anticipated despite delays of weeks or months. When settlements included multiple families, women organized quilting bees, barn raisings, or harvest gatherings that combined necessary work with precious social contact. These rare community events sustained spirits through long periods of solitude. The medical challenges of frontier life fell disproportionately on women's shoulders. As the default healers and midwives in most communities, women delivered babies, nursed the ill, and treated injuries with whatever resources they could muster. Their medical knowledge blended folk remedies, practical experience, and information gleaned from domestic medical manuals. The scarcity of formal doctors meant that a woman with a reputation for healing skill might be called to travel miles through difficult conditions to assist neighbours in medical emergencies. I delivered 37 babies in our valley before the first trained doctor arrived, noted Rebecca Crowley of Central Texas. Had no formal learning for it beyond helping my mother with my younger siblings' births and what I could teach myself from books. When someone was hurt or sick, they sent for me as quick as they'd send for the preacher when dying. Child rearing under frontier conditions presented unique challenges. Women taught children at home before schools were established, often using the limited books they'd brought west. They cultivated gardens not just for food but as educational spaces, teaching children to identify plants and understand natural cycles. They preserved cultural traditions through stories, songs and celebrations remembered from their Eastern or European origins. Beneath these daily labours ran currents of psychological stress uniquely shaped by gender expectations. While men who failed in Western ventures could often move on to new opportunities, women remained tied to their family's fate. The emotional labour of maintaining home and family morale under grueling conditions fell largely to them. Contemporary letters and diaries reveal women who presented cheerful faces to their families while privately recording their fears, exhaustion, and occasional despair. Yet the frontier also created circumstances that could expand women's opportunities and challenge traditional limitations. The scarcity of population and the practical demands of survival meant that rigid gender roles sometimes gave way to pragmatic flexibility. Women who could shoot, ride, plough, or build became valuable partners in the struggle to establish homes in difficult environments. This practical necessity contributed to the West's pioneering role in women's legal and political rights. Wyoming Territory's decision to grant women full suffrage in 1869, the first government in the nation to do so, reflected both pragmatic recruitment of female settlers and the recognition of women's essential contributions to frontier communities. When Congress threatened to deny Wyoming statehood unless it revoked women's voting rights, the territory's legislature famously replied, "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without the women." Other Western territories and states followed Wyoming's lead. By 1896, women could vote in Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, while most eastern states restricted suffrage to men until the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. This Western leadership on voting rights was matched by progressive property laws. Many Western territories and states adopted married women's property acts that allowed wives to own property separately from their husbands, a significant departure from the traditional legal doctrine that merged a woman's legal identity into her husband upon marriage. Divorce laws in Western jurisdictions often proved more accessible than Eastern counterparts, with broader grounds for dissolving marriages and more equitable property divisions. While divorce remained socially stigmatized, Western courts typically granted women greater agency in escaping unhappy or abusive marriages than was common in Eastern states during this period. Professional opportunities expanded as well. Western towns desperately needed teachers for their growing schools, and teaching became a respectable career for single women. Medicine, law, and journalism, fields largely closed to Eastern women, sometimes offered openings on the frontier, where skills mattered more than convention. The first female doctor to practice in Colorado, Dr. Susan Anderson, recalled, "In the mining towns, they cared less about your gender than whether you could set a broken bone or treat pneumonia. Necessity opened doors that prejudice would have kept closed back east." Beyond these broader patterns emerged remarkable individual women, whose lives demonstrated the frontier's capacity to both challenge and reinforce gender boundaries. Martha Jane Cannery, better known as Calamity Jane, flouted nearly every convention of proper womanhood. Dressed in men's clothing, she worked as a scout, teamster, and dance hall girl, built a reputation for hard drinking and straight shooting, and created her own legend through a combination of actual exploits and masterful self-promotion. While Calamity Jane represented one extreme of frontier womanhood, entrepreneurs like Mary Ellen Pleasant demonstrated other possibilities. Born into slavery, Pleasant built a substantial fortune through strategic investments in San Francisco real estate and businesses. She used her wealth to support abolitionist causes and civil rights litigation, while running successful boarding houses and restaurants. Her complex legacy includes both her business acumen and her political activism challenging racial discrimination in California. As the 19th century approached its final decade, a momentous transition was unfolding across the American West. The landscape that had defined the national imagination for generations, vast, untamed, beckoning with promise and peril, was undergoing its final transformation. The frontier that had shaped American character and mythology since the nation's founding was vanishing before the eyes of those who had witnessed its heyday. In 1890, an understated statistical notice tucked into the pages of the 11th Census of the United States marked this profound transition with bureaucratic simplicity. Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. With these dry words, the Census Bureau officially declared the American frontier closed. This seemingly administrative pronouncement would take on deeper significance 3 years later, when a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner presented his landmark paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, to a gathering of fellow historians in Chicago during the World's Columbian Exposition. Turner seized upon the Census Declaration to articulate a thesis that would reshape Americans' understanding of their own national identity and development. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward, Turner proclaimed, explain American development. He argued that the frontier experience had been the crucible in which uniquely American traits had been forged: individualism, pragmatism, democratic impulses, and innovation. The encounter between civilization and wilderness had created a distinctively American character. Now, with the frontier's disappearance, the nation stood at a crossroads. For nearly 3 centuries, he observed, the dominant fact in American life has been expansion. What would define American society now that this era had ended? The question resonated deeply in a nation still searching for new purpose after the Civil War's resolution of the slavery question and the completion of continental settlement. The Census Declaration didn't mean that the entire West had suddenly become crowded with settlements and cities. Vast regions remained sparsely populated, with fewer than 2 people per square mile. The cattle ranges of Montana, the deserts of Nevada and Arizona, the mountain valleys of Idaho and Wyoming, these landscapes still embodied much of the wildness that had characterized the frontier. But the crucial difference was that these regions no longer existed beyond the reach of national political and economic systems. The railroad, telegraph, and federal governance had incorporated even the most remote corners into the national fabric. Public reaction to the frontier's closing varied dramatically. For some Americans, particularly those in eastern cities, it triggered anxiety about a fundamental change in national character. Would Americans lose their pioneering spirit without new territories to conquer? Others saw opportunity in a more settled nation that could now focus on developing what it had already claimed rather than continually pushing westward. For Native Americans, who had experienced the frontier's advance as a generations-long disaster, the closing represented both the culmination of their dispossession and, paradoxically, a potential respite from relentless expansion. With no new territories to invade, perhaps the pressure on their remaining lands might finally stabilize. As the frontier era drew to its close, the remaining Western territories made their final push for full incorporation into the Union as states. The process of transition from territory to state had evolved significantly since the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 first established the basic framework. Typically, a territory needed to demonstrate sufficient population, economic viability, and political stability to merit statehood. The final wave of continental state admissions began with the Omnibus Bill of 1889, which brought North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington into the Union. The following year, Idaho and Wyoming achieved statehood. In each case, the transition involved intensive political negotiation, constitution drafting, and debate over the new state's relationship with the federal government. Utah's path to statehood proved particularly complex. Despite meeting population requirements decades earlier, the the territory's admission had been repeatedly blocked due to the Mormon practice of polygamy. Only after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officially renounced plural marriage in 1890 did Congress finally approve Utah's statehood in 1896. Constitution-making in these final Western states reflected both the accumulated wisdom of earlier state formation experiences and the distinctive concerns of Western populations. Water rights received detailed attention in arid states. Provisions for mining and natural resource development acknowledged these regions' economic foundations. Several Western states incorporated progressive governance mechanisms like the initiative, referendum, and recall, giving citizens direct means to enact or repeal legislation. Wyoming and Utah made history by guaranteeing women's right to vote in their state constitutions, decades before the 19th Amendment extended suffrage nationwide. Colorado voters approved women's suffrage by referendum in 1893. These Western innovations in women's political rights reflected both pragmatic frontier experiences, where women's contributions had been essential for survival, and calculated efforts to attract female settlers to regions with heavily male populations. The final continental territories to achieve statehood were Oklahoma in 1907, bringing a dramatic end to Indian Territory, and Arizona and New Mexico in 1912. With these admissions, the political map of the contiguous United States was complete. Alaska and Hawaii would remain territories for decades longer, finally achieving statehood in 1959. As the era of territorial expansion concluded, a remarkable new movement was taking shape, one that represented a profound shift in Americans' relationship with the Western landscape. Rather than viewing the land primarily as a resource to be claimed and exploited, a growing number of voices began advocating for its preservation. The conservation movement emerged from the recognition that the continent's natural wonders and resources were finite and vulnerable. The earliest stirrings of this consciousness can be traced to the establishment of Yellowstone as the world's first national park in 1872. The decision to set aside this extraordinary landscape of geysers, hot springs, and wildlife for public enjoyment rather than private development represented a revolutionary concept. The park was described as a pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, establishing the principle that some landscapes deserved protection from development for their intrinsic values. In the following decades, additional national parks were designated: Yosemite and Sequoia in 1890, Mount Rainier in 1899, Crater Lake in 1902. These early parks faced numerous challenges, including inadequate funding, poaching, and timber theft. The U.S. Army was tasked with protecting Yellowstone until the creation of the National Park Service in 1916 finally provided professional civilian management. No figure embodied the philosophical foundations of the conservation movement more powerfully than John Muir. Born in Scotland and raised in Wisconsin, Muir discovered his spiritual connection to wilderness during rambles through California's Sierra Nevada mountains. His poetic writings about the value of untamed nature touched a deep chord in a nation beginning to recognize what industrialization had already cost in terms of natural beauty and resources. Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, Muir wrote, articulating a new appreciation for wilderness not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a sanctuary essential for human well-being. Through his writings and advocacy, Muir helped Americans develop what he called spiritual eyes, to see intrinsic rather than merely economic value in the landscape. Muir's vision of pure preservation sometimes conflicted with the more utilitarian conservation philosophy championed by Gifford Pinchot, the nation's first professional forester. Pinchot advocated for scientific management of natural resources to ensure the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. While Muir fought to protect wilderness from any development, Pinchot believed in carefully planned, sustainable use. This philosophical tension came to a dramatic head in the battle over the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. When San Francisco sought to dam the valley for water supply following the 1906 earthquake, Muir led passionate opposition. Dam Hetch Hetchy as well. Dam for water tanks the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man. Despite the conservationists' efforts, Congress approved the dam in 1913, deeply disillusioning Muir, who died the following year. Nevertheless, the movement Muir helped inspire continued gaining momentum. President Theodore Roosevelt, an avid outdoorsman and hunter, became conservation's most powerful political champion. During his presidency, 1901 to 1909, Roosevelt established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 wildlife refuges, and more than 100 million acres of national forests. "We have become great because of the lavish use of our resources," Roosevelt declared, "but the time has come to inquire seriously what will happen when our forests are gone." The modernization of the West through technological innovation paralleled these changes in environmental consciousness. The telephone, patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, gradually extended its reach into Western communities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By 1900, many Western towns had telephone exchanges, though service to rural ranches and farms developed more slowly. The technology collapsed the vast distances that had defined frontier isolation, allowing instantaneous communication across mountains and plains that had once required days or weeks to traverse. Electricity transformed Western communities even more dramatically. While major cities like Denver and San Francisco had electric lighting by the 1880s, smaller towns and rural areas lagged far behind. The 1902 Reclamation Act, which funded major irrigation projects, had the secondary effect of accelerating rural electrification through hydroelectric power generated at federal dams. Still, as late as the 1930s, only about 10% of rural Americans had electricity, a disparity that would eventually be addressed by the Rural Electrification Administration during the New Deal. The automobile's arrival provoked a transportation revolution across the West. The Ford Model T, introduced in 1908, brought reliable, affordable transportation to ordinary Westerners. With characteristic adaptability, ranchers and farmers modified these vehicles for countless purposes, converting them into makeshift tractors, attaching trailers, even using them as stationary power sources for farm equipment. One Montana rancher observed, "The automobile has done more to end the isolation of ranch life than any other single factor. Yet automobiles required roads, a serious challenge in the vast, rugged West." The Good Roads movement, begun in the 1880s by bicycle enthusiasts, gained powerful momentum with automobile adoption. State highway departments formed, and the federal government gradually increased its involvement in road construction, culminating in the Federal Highway Act of 1921. Slowly, the West's infamous muddy tracks and rutted trails gave way to graded and eventually paved highways. Large-scale irrigation projects represented another transformative technology. The Reclamation Act of 1902 committed federal resources to building dams, reservoirs, and canal systems that would make the desert bloom. The Roosevelt Dam on Arizona's Salt River, completed 1911, the Elephant Butte Dam on the Rio Grande, 1916, and many others impounded western rivers, storing snowmelt and seasonal flows for controlled release during growing seasons. These massive engineering works enabled agriculture in regions that natural rainfall alone could never support. These technological advances accelerated urbanization trends across the West. Denver, Salt Lake City, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles all experienced dramatic growth between 1890 and 1920. Los Angeles, with just over 11,000 residents in 1880, grew to more than 100,000 by 1900 and exceeded 500,000 by 1920, a transformation fueled by railroad connections, irrigation, oil discoveries, and relentless boosterism. The final chapter of armed conflict between Native Americans and the United States government played out against this backdrop of modernization. The Ghost Dance movement, a spiritual revitalization that promised the return of buffalo and disappearance of white settlers, spread among desperate reservation communities in 1889 to 1890. Authorities, misinterpreting the peaceful religious practice as preparation for uprising, moved to suppress it. This misguided intervention culminated in the Wounded Knee Massacre of December 29, 1890, when U.S. cavalry killed approximately 300 Lakota men, women, and children, a tragedy that many historians mark as the final significant armed conflict of the Indian Wars. Smaller incidents continued into the early 20th century. The last armed resistance by Yaquis in Arizona occurred in 1918. Ute bear dance ceremonies were still being disrupted by authorities as late as 1915. But the systematic military campaigns that had characterized previous decades had ended. The final dramatic land opening showed how the homestead system was straining to accommodate remaining settlement pressure. When the Cherokee Strip in Oklahoma opened to settlement in 1893, approximately 100,000 people raced to claim 42,000 homesteads, many finding themselves too late despite their speed. Later openings in Oklahoma used lotteries rather than races to distribute land. By the time the enlarged Homestead Act of 1909 and the Stock-Raising Homestead Act of 1916 expanded claim sizes in recognition of the West's arid nature, The best lands had long since been claimed. Between 1870 and 1900, the population of the western states and territories grew from about 990,000 to over 4,300,000. The region was transforming from America's last frontier into an integrated component of the national economy and culture. Western states increasingly specialized in resource extraction and agriculture, shipping cattle, timber, minerals, and crops to eastern markets while receiving manufactured goods in return. By the time the frontier officially closed, the West had already begun a transition that would continue throughout the 20th century. From a region defined primarily by its wildness and separation from national systems to one characterized by its distinctive integration into those systems. The cowboy had not disappeared, but increasingly he worked for corporate ranching operations and used trucks alongside horses. The prospector remained, but as an employee of large mining companies using industrial equipment rather than pick and pan. The small farmer persisted, but now competed with agricultural corporations employing mechanized equipment. The frontier's closing marked not an ending but a transformation. The West would continue reimagining itself throughout the coming century, as natural resource treasury, as military training ground, as environmental sanctuary, as technological innovation hub, as multicultural borderland. But it would do so within the framework of established states, connected to national systems, and increasingly urban in its population centers. The process that had begun with Lewis and Clark's expedition a century earlier had reached its institutional completion. The West had been incorporated, though never fully tamed. As the sun set on the frontier era, the West began its second life, not as a physical place defined by geography, but as a powerful idea taking root in the American imagination. The physical closing of the frontier may have been declared in 1890, but the symbolic frontier was just beginning its most influential journey through the nation's cultural landscape. While ranchers still worked cattle on western ranges and miners still descended into mountain shafts, something new was emerging, a mythic West that would ultimately shape American identity more profoundly than the historical West itself. This transformation began on the pages of inexpensive publications that brought Western adventures to readers across the nation. Dime novels with lurid covers depicting heroic cowboys, menacing Indians, and damsels in distress sold by the millions in the late 19th century. Series featuring characters like Deadwood Dick and Buffalo Bill presented highly romanticized versions of frontier experiences to an eager public. Though bearing little resemblance to the complex realities of Western life, these sensationalized tales established narrative patterns that would endure for generations. The lone hero standing against lawlessness, the clash between wilderness and civilization, the redemptive power of frontier violence. Buffalo Bill Cody, a genuine frontiersman who had worked as a Pony Express rider, Army scout and buffalo hunter, recognized the commercial potential in these Western mythologies. His Wild West show, launched in 1883, transformed actual Western skills like horseback riding and shooting into theatrical spectacle. Audiences across America and Europe marveled at displays of frontier prowess performed in arena settings, complete with staged Indian attacks on stagecoaches and settler cabins. For many Easterners and Europeans, these performances provided their most vivid impression of Western life. Carefully crafted entertainment presented as authentic experience. Among the show's stars was Annie Oakley, whose shooting demonstrations challenged gender assumptions while reinforcing frontier mythology. Though born in Ohio, far from the frontier, Oakley became an iconic Western figure through her association with the Wild West show. Her exceptional marksmanship and modest demeanor made her a female frontier hero who somehow didn't threaten Victorian sensibilities, a carefully balanced persona that expanded the Western myth while maintaining its essentially conservative framework. Native American performers in these shows faced complex choices. By participating in reenactments of their own people's defeat, they helped perpetuate stereotypes that reduced diverse cultures to a generic Indian identity. Yet these performances also provided economic opportunities at a time when reservation conditions were often dire. Some, like Sitting Bull, who briefly toured with Buffalo Bill, used their earnings to benefit struggling tribal members. The spectacle of show Indians demonstrated how Western myth-making could simultaneously exploit, preserve, and distort indigenous experiences. Literature elevated Western myths beyond simple entertainment toward a more sophisticated cultural mythology. Owen Wister's novel The Virginian, 1902, established the template for the literary Western. Its taciturn hero, skilled with horses and guns but governed by a personal code of honor, became the archetype for countless cowboy protagonists to follow. The novel's famous line, "When you call me that, smile," captured the controlled violence and personal dignity that would characterize the mythic Western hero. Wister's West was already nostalgic, a vanishing landscape where natural nobility could flourish away from the corrupting influences of Eastern civilization. Zane Grey further developed this romantic vision in dozens of novels that painted the West in vivid hues. His Riders of the Purple Sage in 1912 and subsequent works presented the landscape itself as a character, vast, beautiful, and morally purifying. Gray's tremendous popularity, with over 40 million books sold during his lifetime, ensured that generations of Americans would imagine the West through his romanticized lens, where good men found redemption in open spaces and honest conflict. When motion pictures emerged as a new medium, the West provided natural subject matter. Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery, 1903, considered by many the first narrative film, established the Western as a cinematic staple. Silent westerns starring actors like William S. Hart and Tom Mix further refined the visual vocabulary of the mythic West. Dramatic landscapes, moral clarity, and physical action replacing psychological complexity. By the 1920s, Hollywood had established conventions for Western storytelling that would endure for decades. White hats and black hats signaling moral alignment, climactic showdowns in dusty streets, redemptive violence solving problems that law and society could not address. These cultural productions did more than entertain. They helped shape American national identity at a crucial historical moment. As the United States emerged as a global industrial power and absorbed waves of new immigrants, the mythic West provided a unifying national story. It suggested that something essentially American had been forged in the frontier experience, a set of values and characteristics that distinguished Americans from their European ancestors. No one articulated this idea more influentially than historian Frederick Jackson Turner. His frontier thesis, first presented in 1893, argued that the continual process of settling the frontier had created American democracy and national character. The existence of an area of free land, Turner wrote, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. This thesis suggested that American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States followed a unique historical path, stemmed directly from the frontier experience. Though later historians would challenge many aspects of Turner's interpretation, his ideas permeated American self-conception. The notion that the national character had been formed through the conquest of wilderness became a central element of American identity. Politicians increasingly invoked frontier imagery and metaphors to frame contemporary challenges. Theodore Roosevelt's strenuous life philosophy explicitly linked national vigor to the frontier experience, while his conservation policies simultaneously reflected anxiety about the frontier's disappearance. The concept of rugged individualism, the self-reliant pioneer requiring minimal government intervention, emerged as a powerful political force, even as the actual West depended heavily on federal investments in dams, roads, and military protection. Western imagery proved remarkably adaptable to diverse political purposes. Both conservative calls for limited government and progressive demands for breaking up monopolies could invoke frontier traditions to support their causes. The mythic West became a shared cultural reference point even as Americans disagreed about its meaning. Environmental attitudes similarly reflected ambivalent interpretations of the Western experience. The frontier myth celebrated the conquest of wilderness while simultaneously fostering reverence for spectacular Western landscapes. John Muir's preservationist ethic, which led to the establishment of national parks, drew strength from the same cultural currents that had earlier justified resource extraction and indigenous displacement. The West thus bequeathed a contradictory environmental legacy, both exploitation and conservation, development and preservation. As the 20th century progressed, the mythic West retained its cultural power while finding expression through new media. Radio shows like The Lone Ranger brought Western adventures into American living rooms. Western films reached their artistic peak in the mid-20th century, with directors like John Ford creating complex visual poetry from frontier myths in films like Stagecoach, 1939, and The Searchers, 1956. The introduction of television brought westerns like Gunsmoke and Bonanza into American homes on a weekly basis, further cementing the genre's cultural centrality. Yet even as Western imagery pervaded popular culture, scholars began reassessing the historical reality behind the myths. The new Western history movement, emerging in the 1970s and 1980s, challenged traditional triumphalist narratives. Historians like Patricia Nelson Limerick argued that the West should be understood not as a process, the advancing frontier of Turner's thesis, but as a place where diverse peoples competed for resources and power. This approach emphasized the experiences of previously marginalized groups and highlighted the environmental consequences of Western development. Indigenous perspectives gained particular prominence in this reassessment. Native American writers and scholars articulated understandings of Western history centered on dispossession and survival rather than pioneering achievement. Works like Vine Deloria Jr.'s Custer Died for Your Sins, 1969, and D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, 1970, brought indigenous historical perspectives to mainstream audiences, challenging mythic interpretations that had rendered Native Americans as either savage obstacles or vanishing relics. Environmental history emerged as another crucial framework for reinterpreting the West. Scholars documented how the region's development had been shaped not just by human ambition, but by ecological constraints. The arid nature of much Western land had necessitated massive federal water projects and created persistent resource conflicts. Rather than seeing the West as a blank slate for pioneering individualism, environmental historians revealed complex interdependencies between humans, landscapes, and government policies. Gender and ethnic diversity received renewed scholarly attention as well. The mythic West had centered largely on Anglo men, but historical research illuminated the crucial roles played by women, Mexican Americans, African Americans, Asian immigrants, and others in Western development. The simplified morality tales of traditional Western narratives gave way to more nuanced understandings of cultural encounter and conflict. Yet despite this scholarly reassessment, the mythic West retained its hold on popular imagination. Western films and literature evolved rather than disappeared, often incorporating more complex themes while maintaining core elements of the frontier mythology. The revisionist westerns of the 1960s and 1970s, like Little Big Man, 1970, and McCabe and Mrs. Miller, 1971, questioned traditional heroic narratives while still drawing power from Western imagery and themes. The contemporary American West exists as both physical reality and cultural idea, with tension between the two. Real Western communities face challenges far removed from frontier mythology: rapid urbanization, water scarcity, economic transitions, and changing demographics. Cities like Phoenix, Denver, and Las Vegas rank among the nation's fastest-growing urban areas, their expansion driven by air conditioning, retirement migration, and technology industries rather than cattle or mining. These metropolitan centers, home to most Westerners today, bear little resemblance to the rural imagery that still dominates cultural representations of the region. Resource management debates continue to shape Western politics, though now framed through contemporary concerns about climate change, biodiversity, and sustainability, rather than simple development versus preservation. Public lands, the vast federal holdings that make up significant portions of many Western states, remain contentious. Disputes over grazing rights, mining claims, recreation access, and wilderness designation reflect competing visions of the Western landscape's purpose and value. The divide between rural and urban West has intensified, with cultural and political polarization reflecting different economic realities and historical memories. Rural communities maintaining traditional resource-based economies often embrace frontier mythology as affirmation of their values and history. Urban centers, increasingly diverse and connected to global economies, sometimes view these same myths as outdated or problematic. Yet the mythic West provides shared reference points across these divides, a common cultural language even when interpreted differently. Tourism and heritage preservation represent another complex intersection of mythology and reality. Historic sites throughout the region commodify Western history for visitors, often balancing entertainment expectations against historical accuracy. Ghost towns, rodeos, dude ranches, and Western museums offer experiences that simultaneously preserve, transform, and simplify the region's past. Indigenous communities have increasingly asserted control over how their histories are presented, developing tribal museums and cultural centers that challenge traditional narratives. The West's mythological power extends far beyond regional boundaries. Internationally, Western imagery continues to symbolize American identity. Cowboy hats and Levi's jeans recognized globally as American cultural exports. Western themes appear in everything from Japanese anime to Italian fashion, demonstrating the remarkable adaptability of frontier imagery across cultural contexts. As we conclude our journey through Western history, we might wonder why these myths have proven so enduring. Perhaps the West's greatest legacy is not any particular historical event or development, but rather its capacity to serve as America's most powerful origin story, a narrative flexible enough to accommodate changing values while maintaining core themes of independence, opportunity, and reinvention. And the tension between historical complexity and mythic simplicity remains unresolved, just as the contradictions within Western mythology itself, between individualism and community, conquest and conservation, violence and justice, continue to reflect broader tensions within American identity. The West's place continues to evolve ecologically, demographically, and economically. The West's idea continues to shape how Americans understand their national character and history. Neither can be fully separated from the other, as mythology influences how Westerners interact with their landscape and environment, while changing regional realities continuously modify the cultural meaning of the frontier. This ongoing dialogue between myth and reality, past and present, ensures that the American West remains not just a historical subject, but a living, contested element of national identity. As the first light of the 20th century dawned across the Western landscape, it illuminated a world transformed. The frontier that had defined American experience for generations had been declared closed. The last territories had achieved statehood. The final Indian wars had been fought. The great cattle drives had faded into memory. Yet the story of the West was far from over. It was merely entering a new chapter, one where myth and reality would dance together across the American imagination for generations to come. Our journey has taken us across vast distances, both physical and metaphorical. We've witnessed the ancient peoples who first called these lands home, developing sophisticated cultures attuned to every whisper of the natural world. We've followed Spanish explorers and French trappers as they ventured into lands unknown to European eyes. We've ridden alongside pioneer wagons creaking westward beneath prairie skies, watched cattle drives flowing like rivers across the plains, and felt the earth tremble with the hammering of railroad spikes binding a continent together. Through gold rushes and range wars, through the rise of cities and the fencing of open ranges, we've seen how this landscape shaped the people who inhabited it just as surely as they shaped the land. The West demanded adaptation, innovation, and resilience. It punished hubris and rewarded cooperation, despite the enduring myths of rugged individualism that would later come to dominate its telling. The story of the American West is fundamentally about encounter between peoples, between cultures, between humans and environment. Sometimes these encounters produced violence and dispossession, as when native peoples faced the relentless tide of settlement, or when Hispanic communities found themselves suddenly foreigners in lands their families had occupied for generations. Other times, these encounters created unexpected cooperation and cultural exchange, new identities forged in the crucible of frontier experience. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Western history is how a single landscape could simultaneously represent such different realities to different people. For Native Americans, it was ancestral homeland, embedded with spiritual meaning and sustaining their ways of life. For Eastern settlers, it represented opportunity and reinvention, a blank slate on which to write new chapters of their lives. For corporations and governments, it was resources to be catalogued, extracted, and managed. These competing visions continue to shape contemporary America. Debates over public lands, water rights, energy development, and cultural heritage still echo the fundamental questions that defined the Western experience. Who decides how the land should be used? Whose stories deserve to be remembered? What balance should be struck between development and preservation? The West today remains a place of striking contradictions. Urban centers like Denver, Phoenix, and Las Vegas grow at extraordinary rates while rural communities struggle with declining populations. Ranchers whose families have worked the same land for generations share fence lines with wealthy newcomers seeking scenic retreats. National parks protect sublime landscapes, while nearby regions face environmental challenges from resource extraction. Yet beyond its physical reality, the West endures as America's most powerful internal myth, a symbolic landscape where our national dreams and anxieties play out in endless variations. The cowboy, that most adaptable of American icons, continues to shape how we imagine independence and authenticity. The frontier, though long closed according to census maps, remains an essential metaphor for opportunity and challenge. As our journey concludes beneath a western sky painted with fading light, we can appreciate how this remarkable chapter in human experience continues to shape our world. The trails worn by pioneer wagons may have grown faint, but the paths they established in the American imagination remain deeply etched. Like riders heading homeward at dusk, we carry with us not just knowledge of what happened beneath these vast horizons, but a deeper understanding of how those events continue to echo through our national story, as enduring as the ancient stones of Monument Valley and as dynamic as the ever-changing course of the mighty Colorado.